The atmosphere in the courtroom was heated to the max. The crowd, hungry for justice, settled under the windows, frantically demanded to punish the defendant. It is understandable, because the case was egregious and high profile. The murder of the businessman David Patrick Johnson stirred up not only the city, but the entire region. The son killed his own father. What can you say? The motive for the murder was banal and old as the world: money, inheritance, in general the most base passions. All the media of the region were abuzz about this news. Newspapers were full of headlines. Millionaire's son went for murder. Son kills his father, or the story of how money drives you crazy, and so on. The news appeared in the yellow press as well as in the serious publications of Boston. The common people were outraged. These rich people have gone completely crazy, they said, in stores, hospitals, public transportation. They think that because they have money, they can do anything. And the most desperate came to the courtroom and poured out their righteous anger. Murder for life. Let the murderer rot in prison, they chanted. Jessica, the defendant's stepmother, had a confused look. How can this be? Her eyes said as she married Johnson. She already had a son, Michael, who also attended the trial. He was one of the crowd of gawkers, while Jason, the rich man's native son, sat in the dock. Now that was ridiculous. Jason glanced furtively at his half-brother. Their gazes met for a second, and Jason saw the contempt in Michael's eyes. He turned away quickly, and the accused's expression returned to one of detachment. The look in Jason's eyes made it clear that he was resigned to his fate. He knew that his chances of acquittal were minimal, or, more accurately, non-existent. The people who disliked the children of the rich had long ago given Jason a verdict, and all he could do was wait. And what is there to wait for when the defendant's guilt is undeniable? There was concrete evidence against him. On August 13, 1999, Jason Patrick Johnson was apprehended in his father's office with a bronze candlestick in his hands, the prosecutor said in a monotone. At the time of discovery, David Patrick Johnson was already dead. According to witnesses, the defendant was covered in blood. Jason covered his eyes. It was clear as day to those present, but it wasn't to him. The boy had a lot of questions. For example, who had called the police? A mystery no one would ever solve, because no one would want to. I mean, here he is, ready. Not even a suspect anymore, but an accused, a defendant. So why solve anything? The lawyer took the floor. Alas, a public defender. Stepmother didn't have a dime for a good lawyer. Well, it was understandable. Jason Patrick Johnson, will you tell the court what happened? He asked the defendant. Despite his pessimistic attitude, the son of the murdered businessman did not think of giving up in the hope of getting the necessary testimony. Jason had been hinted more than once that he was in a bad way. But as his father liked to say, as long as we are alive, there is always hope. And the defendant began his story. On the evening of August 13th, I entered my father's office. What was the purpose of your visit? Inquired defense counsel. I wanted to talk about the division of the spheres of business, Jason replied. Suddenly he realized with horror that the provocative questions were about to begin. The division of business. You could say that's a motive, but a word is not a sparrow. Well, there's my father lying there covered in blood. Yes, he died in my arms, and I took the candlestick by accident, but I didn't kill him. Why would I kill my father, who was everything to me? For inheritance. I would have gotten my share anyway. You would have, Michael replied. Good point, brother. Jason made what he thought were reasonable arguments, but in vain. Everything pointed to the fact that he was the killer. In the name of the Russian Federation, Jason Patrick Johnson, born in 1965, is sentenced to 20 years in prison. A gloating murmur ran through the room, and the defendant thought detachedly, well, that's it. The jury took into account neither Jason's cooperation with the investigation, nor the presence of a young daughter, whom he raised alone. Jason's wife died in childbirth. I'll be back, he said when he was given the last word. I'll be back. I'm going to get justice. The press didn't even try to hide their smirks. It was too unbelievable. And everyone knew it when the convict was led away. He met Michael's gaze again and noticed the triumphant smile on his face. Why would that be? Or maybe it was just Jason's imagination that Johnson steps and turned away hurriedly, as if he didn't want anything to do with the killer. Tough luck, Brother Michael thought, and hurried out of the courthouse. Outside, the press was already waiting for him and his mother. No comment. Waved away the newly appointed successor of the business from the representatives of the writing fraternity. Mother and son got into the car and drove away to the apartment, which was now at their complete disposal. 20 years had passed. Young, beautiful, expensively dressed brunette drove home, despite the fact that it was the second half of August. The heat outside was stifling, Jessica, the daughter of a wealthy businessman, drove up to the store to buy water and fruit. Today was her lucky day. Beautiful dark hair, pretty face. The girl noted with displeasure that the only place to park her foreign car was the corner, but there was nothing to do. Jessica turned off the engine and suddenly felt unbearably hot. It was weird. The air conditioning seems to be working, she thought. Why is it so hot? And when the girl smelled the smell of burning, she felt sick. But that was just the beginning. The car, literally cornered, suddenly caught fire and she was trapped. Jessica rushed to get out of the car, but there was no way. The plastic handle, which was already beginning to melt, did not give in, and the girl was almost resigned to the prospect of burning alive. But apparently there is a God in the world. A poorly dressed man appeared out of nowhere, homeless by the looks of it. Without wasting a second, he broke the glass and, risking his life, rescued Jessica from the fiery captivity. "Hurry up," he shouted, pushing the girl aside. The explosion could go off at any second. The car exploded a few seconds after the homeless man, along with Jessica, were a safe distance away. "Thank you so much." From the bottom of my heart, she thanked the homeless man. "After the shock, you're a very brave man." "No, really," he said, embarrassed. "No, really," exclaimed the girl. "After all, except you, no one dared to do such a deed. Tell me, how can I find you in case of emergency?" "In case of what?" hummed the homeless man, repeating Jessica's last words. Well, now she was embarrassed. "It's not a big deal. And I'm a stranger." Pilgrimy grinned. "Settled all this in the Boston train station area, so that's where you can look for me if you need me." She nodded with a smile, noting that her savior was quite young, perhaps even handsome. "And if you dress him up in decent clothes, oh God, I can't believe what I'm thinking," Jessica reminded herself. "I see," she nodded. "Good luck, and thank you." Likewise, the homeless man said, and walked away as if he'd never been there. Then the police, fire department, and tow trucks arrived. Jessica gave a statement, talked to the officers, and then called a cab and went home with a sense of accomplishment. "Why'd you take a cab?" Dad asked. "There's something wrong with the car," Jessica exclaimed, and recounted her misfortunes. "I see," he said dryly, and went into the house. She did not expect her father to be worried, and then offered her hot tea and a cozy warm plaid. In fact, there was no family connection between them. Michael was almost an uncle to Jessica. Why almost? Simple. He was the half-brother of her father, that is, Jason Johnson, who was convicted 20 years ago. Jessica knew that her own father had been sent to prison, from which he never returned. Michael's mother, Jessica Borisovna, had died a long time ago. As far as Jessica knew, she was terminally ill. The girl's foster father was a very unpleasant type. Michael constantly infringed on her and everything he touched. Jessica never received any pocket money from him, and those expenses, without which one way or another could not do without, were calculated literally to the cent. It was horrible. Jessica was so hurt, it was beyond words. If there was one thing he could save money on, it was his niece, his stepdaughter. The car Michael had bought her was a used car. He wouldn't have bought anything at all. But it is not proper for the daughter of a businessman to walk, ride the subway, not according to status. Her business acquaintances would have laughed at her, and the fact that the car is used, it's no big deal. No one would even check it, especially since the car looked quite presentable. Except, despite that, there was a fire. And if it hadn't been for that bum, Michael would have been preparing for her funeral. Jessica imagined for a moment what kind of funeral he would have organized, and he would have saved money. Cheap wreaths, cheap coffin. Naturally, no music, let alone makeup. Jessica shuddered. Ugh, she thought. I can't believe she'd think of such a thing. Thank God I'm still alive. That's just black humor. But seriously, Jessica was very hurt. She'd grown up in a wealthy family, lived in a beautiful 2-story mansion, but she had absolutely no privileges. The girl knew that her peers from wealthy families, if not laughing at her, then discussed her outfits from no longer relevant collections, or the same unfashionable car that had burned so ignominiously in the parking lot. And she understood them perfectly well. And Jessica also studied at the university on a budget. However, she didn't care about that. The scholarship, of course, was ridiculous, but it was still a penny. From time to time, Jessica thought that the reason for such attitude of Papa and Michael to her was that her father was Wesnan. But what was her fault? After all, children are not responsible for their parents. After taking a bath, she went to her room on the 2nd floor, turned on her laptop, intending to watch some romantic comedy. Her cell phone rang. Dad, what did he want? I wondered. Jessica, I've been thinking, Michael said. Anyway, Why don't you invite that tramp over for dinner? What? Was the girl taken aback? Michael, what the foster father chuckled. You gotta respect the man. After all, he saved your life. Why would you insult him? The tramp was a man, too. Jessica didn't think to object to the last argument. The tramp was indeed a man, too. It was just that such an invitation was too atypical for Michael. Even the average citizen didn't consider a homeless man a human being for tea. And even homeless people weren't considered as such. It's not like he got his head screwed on a winter's day in the sun. The next day, Jessica went looking for the stranger, Pilgrim as the homeless man called himself. It was a pleasure to find the vagrant. Settled in the train station area, Jessica remembered his words, so look for him there. What? Let's start there, she reasoned. Her search led her to a kebab shop in Station Square, where she thought the employees might know the tramp by sight. She decided to approach one of them. Jessica, excuse me, do you know a homeless man? Tall, skinny, but pretty tough. The Caucasian kebab maker's wide, stinging black eyebrows crept upward, and Jessica, realizing that she had said something stupid, hastened to clarify that he was quite young. The kebab maker, smiling with dazzling white teeth, asked, "Why would such a pretty girl need some tramp?" He winked and added, "I'd rather come over tonight. We'll go to my place, bathhouse, sauna, kebab, beer, champagne." Jessica, no, thank you, she politely declined. I really need this particular tramp, on business. The kebab man, what's his name? There was disappointment in the young Jigit's voice. Jessica just sighed. The fact that she had forgotten to ask for a name was a big omission, though how was she to know that a vagrant might be needed by her father? Jessica, I don't know. The kebab man, confused, well, maybe there's a picture. Jessica shook her head. The kebab man, strange thing, no name, no photo. How do you look for them then? There are as many as slaughtered around here, but I can help. He smiled meaningfully. Jessica, overjoyed, really. The kebab man, sure, just one kiss and I'll help you. Offended, Jessica walked away. It took 2 more days to find her. She was helped by an observant boy of about 11, also a vagrant. The boy asked in a businesslike manner, tall, stout, could that be Max Pilgrim? Jessica rejoiced, realizing she was on the right track. Jessica, that sounds like him. Do you know where to find him? The boy mouthed importantly, I know, but that information costs money. Jessica gave him some money. The boy nodded. Then it's a deal, and led Jessica to some woods behind the station building. Julia suddenly thought that the boy had decided to take her into the woods and rob her. What if he killed her? Julia was suddenly terrified. She wanted to run away. But then something like a dugout came into view. We'll stop here, said the young guide carelessly. Give me the money. But I haven't seen him, said the girl reasonably. You think, said the boy approvingly. And they climbed inside. Michael Pilgrim was sitting at a table with a group of similarly poor people, eating quick noodles from a round paper bowl. An old electric kettle was boiling in the corner, standing on a large stump. Hello, Julia greeted her savior, and, noticing his perplexed look, asked, Didn't you recognize me? Should I? I mean, in general, to know you or should, asked the tramp, which confused her very much. 2 days ago, you saved my life, she replied, pulling herself together. There was a fire in my car, and you helped me out of it. I did, Michael nodded. As if it were no big deal, how could I ask for a light? And that my father told me to invite you to visit? He wants to thank you. And I wanted, the tramp said firmly. It's up to you, of course, but my father, you know, he said in a deep voice. Everything with you rich people is measured by money. Why do you say that? Julia thought money was out of the question, especially when someone like Papa David was involved. Don't you want to thank me? The enterprising boy reminded himself. Yes, of course. Julia caught up and, taking $10 out of her purse, handed it to the young vagrant. He nodded in satisfaction. Then he was blown away. And Julia continued to persuade Michael. He was reluctant for a long time, but finally agreed. Why? The boy didn't know. Or maybe it was a premonition? Come in, David said, trying to sound like a hospitable host. Frankly speaking, Michael felt terribly uncomfortable. His gaze was too intense. It was like an X-ray. They went into the living room, where the table was set for 3 people. In the middle of the table stood a large plate of dumplings, a salad of tomatoes and cucumbers, and a basket of fresh bread. It all looked very appetizing. But the guest found such a table a little strange. It was not the way he had imagined a meal in a rich house. How could a vagabond know what wealthy people ate? Besides, he assumed that rich people might like homemade dumplings and simple salads. "Have a drink." David offered me a drink. "No, thank you." "I don't drink," Michael refused. "Maxim, you don't drink," said the host. "I think I'll have a gin and tonic." For about 20 minutes they were silent, concentrating on their food. The tramp ate carefully, without hurrying, and Julia liked it very much. "Actually, he doesn't look like a bum," it suddenly occurred to her. "Your name is Maxim, isn't it?" David asked his guest, even though the man had introduced himself to him. Maxim nodded. "Maxim, do you like Julia?" The tramp almost choked on his dumpling, and when he looked at the owner's daughter, he realized that she was close to the same. "And why this question?" asked the guest. "Well, just answer. Do you like it or not?" "Well, I like it," said Max. "Pretty, probably good character. And she's graduating from university this school year," David said proudly. "She's going to be a translator or something." "I'm happy for her," the homeless man nodded, not understanding what the questions were about. Julia didn't understand either, but she realized that her father had brought this up for a reason. Oh, for a reason. "I'm so glad," the landlord smiled. "Well, that's enough of that. I'd like to offer you Julia as my wife." "Well, a reward for what?" Max asked. "How could it be a reward for what?" "You saved her life," said the tramp. "I saved her life," said the tramp. All right, David said impatiently, thinking that the hobo was not so simple. "But it's okay. I've been screwed over before." "It doesn't matter," he said again. "I could use smart, capable guys like you, Maxim." "What about Julia?" David asked, perplexed. "Julia listens to me." So, looking at the girl, Max doubted it. Maybe she had obeyed her father before. This time, however, judging by the look on her face, she was the least likely to do so, and he wasn't far from the truth. "I always knew I wasn't loved," David sighed. Julia pondered. But this was too much even for him. How is it possible to marry without her knowledge? It's just unbelievable. "Isn't it, Julie?" he asked his daughter with pressure. "Daddy, I'm Julie, and I didn't know what to say," the girl admitted. In good conscience, I should have objected, but my tongue felt like it was stuck to the sky, and it was useless. If David Patrick Johnson had something in his head, then that was his final decision. Michael had enough of sitting. He got up and walked around the living room while father and daughter talked. The vagabond looked at the pictures without much interest, more of a machine. Suddenly one of the pictures caught his eye. "But it can't be," Michael thought, looking into the young man's face, unable to hold back the tears that came to his eyes. "Is something wrong?" Johnson inquired, noticing the look on his face. "Nothing's wrong," assured his guest, coping with his emotions. Michael sank into thought. The young drifter hadn't even realized that there were hidden sect cameras throughout the house. David Patrick Johnson had been suffering from persecution mania since childhood. He himself, however, he did not think so and said that he has a well-developed instinct of self-preservation. In addition, the businessman had one weakness: to observe people from the outside to analyze their behavior. This is an amateur psychologist for whom people are nothing more than puppets, Johnson reflected. Around the perimeter of each room, he ordered cameras to be installed, and now David, having seen his guest off, was reviewing the tape. Here they are having a conversation. And then, when I voiced my proposal, the bum gets up, walks around the living room, lingers on one of the pictures and cries. Yes, he was crying on the tape. It was very plain to see the tears running down this Michael's cheeks. And what would that mean? Thought a puzzled David. The photo the guest stopped beside was of his half-brother Jason Patrick Johnson. Does he really know the bum? The question continued to torment my father. But if that's really the case, where did they meet? We should take a closer look at him. Julia was looking at pictures from a classmate's birthday party when David knocked on her door. "Offended?" he stated. The girl remained silent. Julia, without saying a word, ran off to her room. This was more eloquent than any words, and it could not be said that David liked it. "Well, you should," he said conciliatingly. "He's not a bad guy. You should take a closer look." Julia didn't know what to say. All businessmen wanted to be related to their own kind, and they didn't have it all their own way. But on the other hand, the girl did not want to become the spouse of some businessman's offspring. Well, yes, what are they, if they do not have to fight for their place under the sun? Rich moms and dads are already all hustled up, she pondered. But Michael. Julia remembered the recent guest and suddenly thought that Daddy David was probably right. There was something about this guy. I guess that's charisma. And real, not created by expensive salons and hairdressers. But marrying him, Julia doesn't even know him. And if she did, then what? Mockingly asked the inner voice. And the girl realized she wanted to get to know Michael better. Her gut told her that this guy wasn't all that easy. So maybe she should really get to know him. But without getting married, of course. Now Julia knew where Michael lived, so now she wouldn't have to look for him. Michael Pilgrim occasionally worked part-time unloading merchandise at stores. That's what he did for a living. One of the places he worked part-time was a small store that sold confectionery. "Can I give you some more cake?" With a motherly look at Michael, Ann Adamson, the store owner, suggested. She really liked the guy. When Michael came to work part-time, Ann always had something tasty for her favorite. This kind woman of 50 years and a little always wondered why he did not study and did not try to realize himself. He's a capable boy, she thought. However, Ann never gave up hope of convincing the boy to think seriously about his life. "Ann, good afternoon," she heard a familiar voice. Jessica stood before her. "Hello, Jessica," spoke the shopkeeper affectionately. "Anything new?" "Suggest something new. I can recommend the chocolate pudding cake with strawberries." The salesperson smiled. "But your favorite red velvet is also available. It's all fresh, just unloaded." "Ben." So what about the tactic? Julia turned to the handsome strange guy and exclaimed in surprise at Ben. "He's the one," grinned the new acquaintances, you could say potential fiancés. "So you two know each other?" Ann Adamson was unknowingly delighted. "Well, sort of," Julia replied. "Sort of," she nodded. "I'll say more. Ben saved my life." "Really?" exclaimed the hostess in surprise. "Ben, is it true?" The tramp was modestly silent. Really, Julia answered for him. "Then we should drink to that." Adamson smiled at them. "Tea, of course. Come into my office." She knew it would be useless to contradict Ann, and she didn't want to. Julia had always enjoyed talking to this woman. They'd met at the gym, and despite the age difference, they'd become friends. 3 years have passed since then, but Julia's friendship with the owner of the confectionery store only grew stronger. Sometimes the girl thought that the main reason for her affection for Ann was that she grew up without a mother. In addition, the relationship with Daddy Michael left much to be desired, and Ann Adamson was simply impossible not to love. Kind, open, with a great sense of humor, and always ready to come to the aid of someone who needs it. That's just the way she was. Anyway, Julia and Ann Adamson were friends, and now it turns out that the eldest friend of Michael Johnson's adopted daughter knows Ben. So maybe it's fate. What did you do to please him? Very nice conversation this time. Julia was pleasantly surprised by Ben. What a smart, well-read guy. The girl thought with surprise. Very good. Ann Adamson whispered to her, catching the moment, and added with an obvious hint. He would like a girl who would take him in hand. But where would he get one? "How long have you two known each other?" Julia asked Ben as they left the store. "No," he shrugged. "I've been coming here part-time for a few months." "Tell me a little about yourself," she asked. "Wouldn't you like to?" But Julia was silent. Something told her that Ben might not like her question. But having said, speak, she looked at him with interest and was definitely waiting for an answer. Julia continued, "Wouldn't you like to get an education, get a good job, and in general live like a normal person, you mean?" Ben asked mockingly. "What's your problem? How am I supposed to live?" "There's no sadness," the surprised girl replied. "It's just that everything is easy for you." The tramp cut him off and walked toward the bus stop. Julia stared after him in despair, and suddenly, as if not realizing what she was doing, ran after him. "Ben," she shouted. But the boy didn't even turn around. Ben, Julia caught up with the tramp after all, and just in time. Because at that moment a bus was coming, heading towards the bus station, and the girl miraculously managed to jump on it. "Ben, what did I ask you?" she exclaimed. "For someone like you, maybe nothing." Ben shrugged. "Well, to anyone. Everyone's the same. Everyone." Not everyone. Ben realized with horror that he was attracted to this girl, but he realized there was no future for them. No matter what her father said, Ben would be something to him. And then he suddenly remembered how this guy had offered him Julia as his wife, and he hadn't failed to publicize it. He said she was going to university. She'd be a translator or something. So he said, "Good daddy, he doesn't even know what his daughter will be when she graduates. He doesn't seem to want to know." That's how you treat a kid. Ben suddenly felt sorry for the girl. Why did he really yell at her? Those eyes like a hurt little girl's. "I'm sorry about that," Ben said awkwardly. I don't know what came over me. Apology accepted. Julia smiled. Ben, aren't you in a hurry? No, he smiled back. There's a suggestion we sit in a cafe somewhere. To be honest, she hadn't really hoped Ben would agree. But suddenly, okay, replied the hobo, but on one condition. And what condition is that my treat? They sat in the cafe for about 2 hours and couldn't get enough of each other. How does he know so much? Julia wondered. None of these down-and-out majors could match Ben. It's getting dark, the boy noted. Yeah, it's getting dark early now, Julia agreed. You should walk, he suggested. What about you yourself? Chuckled his new friend. I don't burn in fire. I won't drown in water. You don't believe me? I believe, smiled the girl, looking thoughtfully into his eyes. You see, Michael was surprised, looking out the window, and yet she took offense. I, you might say, arranged her fate. The businessman looked curiously at the couple and waited for them to kiss. However, there was no kiss. Julia touched the tramp's shoulder and went home. How was your day? Michael asked good-naturedly. Fine, Julia nodded. It's that Ben. He's the foster daughter. So you two are dating. Daddy, Michael, you're so full of shit. The girl shook her head. Ben was with us 3 days ago. 2 of those days I didn't go anywhere, so when would I have started dating him? Well, yes, Johnson nodded absent-mindedly. I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking. Well, then we'd better speed it up. As an intelligent man, Michael knew he shouldn't do it out of the blue. Otherwise, it could spook the target. Julia should be pushed into it gradually. But to the businessman's great joy, he didn't have to do anything. He hired a private detective to follow Julia. And a week later, the bloodhound reported that the young people were dating. Well, the plague, he thought with satisfaction, looking at the photos that confirmed that his adopted daughter had indeed started dating Skies. Julia, what does your boyfriend do? Michael inquired. Ben works part-time at the stores, she replied. As a salesman? No, of course not, Julia grinned, picturing her boyfriend behind the counter, unloading merchandise. And, is he okay with that? Why am I asking? I'd like to offer him a job at my place. What kind of work? You know, like a security guard or something. We'll figure it out. That kind of generosity was unusual for Michael. I mean, what's weird about it? After all, he had already identified Ben to take. And, to tell the truth, the idea now seemed quite tempting to Julia. But the question is to get Ben to agree, she said thoughtfully. Why wouldn't he? He might, she confirmed sullenly. Michael was even more surprised. And how does he plan to spend the rest of his life in a shack? What, in the woods behind the train station? Julia wondered. And really, what is he going to do next? After that incident in the candy store, Anne had never asked Ben about his plans again. After all, he's a grown man and surely knows what he wants out of life. Julia silently shrugged her shoulders, and Papa Michael said, Anyway, dear, I'll say this, if you want to help your beau, and by the way, talked yourself into it. After all, it's in your best interest too. Johnson winked at his adopted daughter, and she felt uncomfortable, but deep down Julia really wanted to. So why not talk to Ben? What was there to hide? Ben Adams wanted to start a new life. He'd had enough of vagrancy. Although at first it had seemed to him in some way exciting, a kind of adventure. But it could only be interesting when he was young. And, unfortunately, is not eternal. Ben didn't like Michael Johnson, the slippery type. But on the other hand, was this any chance? No, he wasn't after riches, especially since none were in sight. And Ben wanted to be with Julia. And what could he offer her? Living in a dugout. So when his lover suggested working for her adoptive father and living in a mansion, Ben said that was probably an option. Well, what am I saying? Julia rejoiced. 2 weeks later, the former tramp and the entrepreneur's daughter got engaged. Michael's business partners, if they were surprised, didn't show it. They weren't interested in the identity of this poor man. Michael was also just glad that everything worked out the way he wanted it to. When Ben came to him for the second time, Michael said that he would keep order. When asked by the boy what exactly he was supposed to do, Johnson replied, make sure no crap got into the house. Michael was actually one of the residents of the mansion. Once handed over, his duties completely derailed. Everything would have been fine. But Michael puzzled over the question of how the future son-in-law knew his half-brother. In the end, the businessman decided to talk to him straight since Julia and this tramp were doomed. Anne, do you know where Ben is now? Johnson asked the elderly maid. I think he was in the garden with Julia. Well, call him to me, he ordered. Call him in, Ben asked, catching him in the study. Not summoned, but invited. We're practically related, the future father-in-law smiled, though the smile was more like a grin. So what did you want? Michael Vladimirovich Ben asked impatiently. He didn't like being around this man. Ben decided when he and Julia got married, he would move out of his place. It was unlikely that the bride would mind. I was wondering what your connection is to my half-brother. The day I took you out to lunch, you were looking too closely at one photo, and I think you even wept. What do you mean? Ben saddened and began to tell his sad story. After the sentencing, Jason Johnson's attorney appealed, but all he got for his client was a penal colony instead of a maximum security prison. There he met Ben's mother, who worked as a cook. Uncle Jason was like family to me, the future son-in-law said. A good man. You probably know he died of pneumonia. Michael nodded thoughtfully, looking out the window. Where is your mother now after Jason's death? Ben's mother, Olga, didn't want to move on after that. They dreamed of a new life after Jason's release. By the way, he was given a lesser sentence, so the return was real. The young woman did not come to terms with the loss of her beloved and became addicted to alcohol. That's what ruined her. Ben sighed. Suddenly he was angry with himself. And why the hell am I pouring my heart out in front of this moral freak? This is my personal business. Go on, Michael said. Ben remembered what his uncle had said about his daughter. So Julia was that daughter? God, it was a good thing his future father-in-law and former stepfather had turned out to be half-brothers. Otherwise, Ben wouldn't even want to think about it. There's nothing to go on, really, he shrugged. How come you started vagabonding? After his mother died, Ben traveled to Boston for a new life. But the city didn't welcome him too warmly. The day he arrived, Ben got a job at a construction site and his passport was taken away. Fortunately, he had some money and he rented a small house on the outskirts. After a month, his paycheck was still not paid. He had to move out. The employers probably thought that without a passport he would not go anywhere, but he didn't. So Ben had to live on the streets. The bride's father was shocked at the turn of events. What a coincidence, some vagrant, the son of an alcoholic, turns out to be related to his brother. This did not make the businessman happy at all. He decided to get rid of the uncle and at the same time from the adopted daughter. But in order not to look suspicious, Michael would arrange their wedding. The newlyweds would be in his care, and then he would get rid of them both in one fell swoop. He was plotting a brutal plan to destroy the bride and groom. Johnson took over his son-in-law's paperwork. In early October, Ben and Julia became husband and wife. The wedding was modest. Why splurge if they were doomed anyway? But it didn't matter to Ben and Julia. They were together and knew that their married life would be happy regardless of Michael's money. They were determined to make a month's worth of money. Ben said after the wedding banquet, "That's the way it is. We'll live here, and then I'll raise money for a rented apartment. Do you agree?" "Of course I do," Julia exclaimed. A couple days after the wedding, they went to see Ann Adamson. Maybe she'd have some good advice, they thought. Well, first of all, congratulations, said Ann with a smile. And secondly, I'd love to help the new family. Ben, I thought you said you worked in construction. I did, he grimaced, remembering the way his employer had treated him. But then you've got the job in your pocket. A good friend of mine is doing repairs at the cottage. It's nothing special, just cosmetics. Can you do it, of course? I can do it, Ben assured him. The acquaintance turned out to be a nice man of about 45. He paid the Johnson couple in advance. Part of the money they put aside to rent an apartment, the rest they spent on living. True, there wasn't much money. David Patrick Johnson had no intention of helping the new family. He wasn't expected to. Ben and Julia were eagerly counting the days until they finally moved in with Michael. Nothing else mattered. However, fate had it differently. Maid Amber worked for David Patrick Johnson for 20 years, and all this time she and Julia had a tender and touching relationship. The girl lacked a woman's affection, and this kindest of women, God had not given her children. How unfair is life. When you and Ben have children, they'll be my great-grandchildren, Amber said dreamily. But of course Julia smiled, just as long as it wasn't as a maid. That was the way she'd hoped it would be. Amber, come into my office, Michael's commanding voice broke the idyll, which didn't bode well. Is something wrong? She asked timidly. You'll find out, the master said. Michael informed the old maid without any preamble that she was fired. But for what? The stunned Amber whispered. Why, Michael said. It's your age. You've done your time. It's time to retire. The youth thing was jarring, but she didn't seem to mind it at the moment. Amber was more concerned with what she was going to live on. You've been working here for 20 years, David Patrick Johnson added. I'd like to see some new young faces in my house. And imagine if Jessica and I have a baby. And who's going to help them with the baby? You. The old one. Yes, for me it would be happiness. Through tears answered the old assistant. Julia's like my own granddaughter, and now it's not a good time. He continued in his mind and ordered Amber to go pack her things. Okay, I'll leave with dignity, the assistant said, and went to her room. Amber packed her things and tears ran down her cheeks. She considered herself part of the family. Well, it seemed the master didn't think so. There he was, easy on the eyes. Amber, you'll take the check, David Patrick Johnson said, entering without knocking. He didn't even think about the fact that the maid might have changed clothes, but at least he didn't poke. Thank you for that. What pleasure would she have had throwing that envelope of money at that arrogant face? Except there wasn't a dime in her wallet. The card was empty too, so she overcame her pride, nodded, and put the money in the big plaid bag. When Michael left, Amber counted the money in the envelope, and it was exactly half of what she'd gotten. She didn't bother to confront him. She gathered her things and, swallowing tears, left the room. She wanted to leave unnoticed, but that wish wasn't going to happen. Amber, where are you going? Julia asked, not without surprise, as she walked up the stairs. And when she saw the tears in her eyes, she realized everything. What's wrong with you? He frowned. Amber said bitterly, Oh, come now, Mr. David. I'm old. It's time for a vacation. I can't cope, it seems. That's not true, Julia said hotly. You're doing a fine job. What's the matter now? Sighed the one that colored her not-so-happy childhood. Suddenly, Julia whispered, I need to talk to you. I'll be waiting for you in the park. The serious expression on Amber Adamson's face didn't just say. It screamed that she was about to tell Julia something very important. She was even getting a little scared. Okay, the foster daughter nodded. I'll be there in about 20 minutes. It was 20 years ago, Amber Adamson began. I had just come to work for David Patrick Johnson, your grandfather. Back then, Johnson's former maid fell silent. It was terribly difficult for her to talk about it. And what happened? Breathlessly, Julia asked. Then your grandfather was killed, the older woman whispered, and what a terrible guess flashed through her brain. But Julia refused to believe it. My father was in jail for that. Yes, for that, Amber Adamson confirmed in a trembling voice. The girl covered her mouth with her hand in horror. So this was why Papa Michael didn't love her. Everything fell into place. But he didn't. He didn't, Julia interjected incredulously. Then who did? Jason Patrick Johnson, are you sure? Are you sure? Amber Adamson said firmly. I saw it with my own eyes. It was Jason Patrick Johnson who hit his father over the head with a candlestick and then flipped it around as if Michael had done it. Jason Patrick Johnson called him into David Patrick Johnson's office on some pretext specifically to set him up, and then called the police. Everything pointed to Michael as the killer. I mean, he kept saying he didn't do it, but who'd listen to him? I mean, that's the way it is here, isn't it? If there's a man, there's a story, isn't there? Yes, Julia said with a sigh. I'm sorry, girl, that I've been quiet all this time. I was just afraid that Jason Patrick Johnson might have straightened me out as well. Julia was shocked, and that Daddy Michael was afraid all along, she realized, afraid of being exposed. It was reckless of him to fire Amber. I guess he figured that since she'd kept quiet for 20 years, the secret would die with her. Well, it didn't. I understand, Julia said, and burst into tears, hugging the maid. To her, she was like family, if not closer. For about 10 minutes they sat hugging. And then Julia said quietly but firmly, You won't get away with it this time. But the statute of limitations. I'll do whatever it takes to get the case overturned, she said firmly, and took her cell phone out of her pocket and dialed the emergency number. Ben walked home after work and thought about the fact that it wasn't long before moving into a rented apartment. What are the police doing here? Ben was frightened when he saw a blue and white car outside his house. He loved his wife Julia very much, and the first thing that came to his mind was, has something happened to her? And when he saw someone being led out, his heart jumped fearfully somewhere in his stomach. Did Michael massacre his adopted daughter? Ben quickened his step, but a policeman blocked his path. Your papers, he said sternly. Please, Ben replied, and pulled a passport from the inside pocket of his jacket. This is my husband, said a perfectly alive and well Julia. He's here from work. Well, I see, the law enforcement officer nodded. For good measure, still looking at Ben's passport, he explained. A criminal case has been opened against Michael Johnson, as Julia had anticipated. The statute of limitations had been disregarded. Her father was posthumously rehabilitated, and his half-brother went to prison. He was charged not only with murder, but also with perjury. All the assets that Michael had went to the rightful owner, that is, the native daughter of the wrongfully convicted Jason Patrick Johnson. Julia, of course, was glad that justice had been served, but if it could bring her father back. "Don't be sad," Ben said quietly as he put his arm around his wife's shoulders. "I'm sure Uncle Jason is watching us from heaven and rejoicing for us. You're right." "You think so?" Julia smiled. "I am sure of it." A month passed. Ben and Julia, though they were already married, decided to have a wedding again. Like the previous one, it wasn't too crowded, but it was very beautiful. For the banquet, they chose one of the best restaurants in the city. "This is the kind of wedding you deserve," exclaimed Amber Adamson, who was the guest of honor, if it weren't for her confession and then testimony in court. Ben and Julia would most likely no longer be in the Ashley, a young, pretty waitress, bustled between tables, taking orders and serving refreshments. Her nimble movements and friendly smile attracted the men's eyes. But she didn't seem to notice it. Her thoughts were far away. She glanced anxiously at her watch, wondering if she'd make it home before her husband, Jason, went on his long-awaited fishing trip. "Ashley's in the clouds again," the stern, middle-aged receptionist called out to her. "You see, the visitors are waiting." Ashley perked up, hurriedly adjusted her apron, and hurried toward the company at the far table. As she walked, she replayed the conversation she'd had with Jason. "I'm going on a 2-night sleepover with some friends," he said. "Do you have to go away for the weekend, Jason?" Ashley asked with a little resentment. "I thought we were going out tonight, like to a movie or a coffee shop." "Oh, come on. What movie?" Jason dismissed the movie with a carefree smile. "It's summertime, and it's a sin to be in the city. When else will you get out with your men? We'll relax and fish. We'll boil some soup, like we should." "Well, maybe I'll come with you," Ashley suggested hopefully. "I'll keep you company and get some fresh air." Jason hesitated for a moment, but then laughed. "Come on, you're not fishing. It's a man's thing, not a woman's thing. We don't take anyone there. Have a rest, and we'll be there and back in no time. Don't worry about a thing." "At least I'll call you once in a while," Ashley sighed. "I'd be worried." "Oh, come on," Jason smiled indulgently. "It's not a good connection. I'll tell you all about it when I get back. Why don't you go shopping, go to the markets, have some fun? What's there to miss?" He winked and left the room. Ashley gave him a wistful look. A bad feeling stirred in her chest. Something's not right. Why is Jason suddenly so eager to go fishing, and he's not even asking me any questions? It's weird. But she didn't dare object to her husband, too accustomed to indulging him. "Jason's such a solid, well-off man. How can I refuse him?" she said, though a worm of doubt lingered inside. "But my husband's been missing a lot of late nights lately, with meetings and negotiations. And now even for 2 days to leave for 2 days, he decided to go. Caress from him like a nail from the wall. He mumbles something or laughs. At least he brings money to the house. So I can't complain. He bought a new car and a fur coat. But lately there's been less money. But it's understandable. Jason's company was going through some tough times," he said. Ashley sighed heavily. "I don't know, maybe I'm just overreacting. My husband's been out with his friends. Who doesn't? Probably the connection there is really lousy. Let him rest, everything will gain strength. He's entitled to it by status." She will finish her Saturday shift and go home. Time will fly by, and Jason will show up Sunday evening, cheerful and alert. In the meantime, my husband was absorbed in the pleasant task of packing. He whistled cheerfully as he went through his gear and put his wading boots, thermos, and freshly bought spinning rod in the trunk of the new SUV. A carnivorous grin shone on his face. He had his wife wrapped around his finger. "Nothing. Let her suffer a little for prevention. I'm going to have a good time with my new girlfriend. That's another thing, hooked up fire girl. And most importantly, no strings attached." After dropping off his things, Jason pulled out his cell phone. "Hello, Jennifer Ann. Hi, it's Jason. Yes, about the lake house. We made plans with you for this weekend, remember? I just want to make sure everything's okay with the reservation." There was a nice woman's voice on the phone. Of course Jason has agreed. And your wife is here, by the way. The house is all ready. I've cleaned it up. The linens are fresh. We got a great view of the lake. You'll see for yourself. So come and relax in comfort. That's nice. They're eagles. Jason, wait, I'll be right there. And this. Thank you for understanding. Oh, no problem. You're welcome. The woman was clearly smiling into the phone. I can see right through people. You and your wife need some alone time. A little romance, so to speak, to rekindle the romance. Come on down. Jason took a drink and passed out. Well, you gotta be alone with your wife. If only the owner of the lodge knew the truth. However, for an extra fee, anyone would know the truth. Ashley's better off not knowing. Let her stay home and cook. That's what she's supposed to do. It's called being a wife. Jason walked quickly down the stairs and headed for the car with his fishing rods in hand. He bumped into Ashley on the doorstep. She was coming home from work, flushed from the smells of the highway. She looked very excited. "Girl, did you decide to go secret fishing after all?" she asked, looking into her husband's eyes. "And maybe I'll go with you. Weekend after all. Well, maybe together?" "Come on," Jason waved her off without anger. "I promised the men. I can't let them down. If you want to invite your friends over, you can sit and talk." He took the pike out of the bag and walked lightheartedly to the car. Ashley gave him a wistful look. "Why don't we get some girlfriends together? We could sit around and talk. Only she doesn't have any close friends. And to be honest, she's just friends, nothing more. She's given her whole life to family life. I mean, how can she make friends?" Ashley went home and made dinner. She didn't like eating at cafes. Not because of the paycheck deduction. It was just that homemade tasted better. "I'll do without shopping," Ashley thought. "First paycheck to buy something? Treat myself? What fun is that?" She started to get ready before she left. She couldn't resist dialing her husband's number. The subscriber was unavailable. She threw the phone away in frustration. Ashley resolutely slammed the door shut. "It's okay. I'll try to get through the next 2 days somehow. I'm not a little girl and I'm my own boss. I can do what I want." The self-compulsion didn't help much, but there was no choice. I just hoped the alarm was false. Jason loved her, after all. He wouldn't cheat on her for nothing. Her husband was already on the highway, driving out of town for what was sure to be a fabulous weekend. April's going to be so excited. I bet she's been waiting. She missed him. He longed for her hot kisses, tender hands, and unbridled passion. Life is good, and it will be even better. Home to the place he'd arranged. Jason parked at a neat log cabin on the shore of a forest lake. The scenery was marvelous. Not a soul around, just what he needed for solitude. Turned off the engine. He stretched until his vertebrae crunched and squeezed his eyes shut, warming himself blissfully. Anticipation came in hot waves, but everything now could be relaxed to the fullest. He climbed out of the car, stretching sweetly as he went. April was already waiting for him on the porch. Tan, slender, in a light-colored sundress, she smiled dazzlingly, flashing her snow-white teeth. "That's my old barrel and wobbled already when I was driving. Well done, my soul." Jason winked playfully, picking the girl up in his arms. "How about we go for a swim, and then we can go on?" April laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. There was a sly sparkle in her eyes. "Sounds like fun. Let me feed you lunch first. You must be hungry from the road." "Yes, I am." Jason picked up on that, kissing her fragrant neck. "But I don't have an appetite for food. So let's start with dessert." Laughing happily, the couple disappeared into the cabin. Jason felt 10 years younger. Almost 24 hours of bliss. No remorse, no boring wife to worry about. It's beautiful. Ashley's heart was pounding in the city. The new dress, of course, was pleasing to the eye, but she couldn't escape the oppressive feeling that something irreparable was happening. But there was no choice. The only thing left to do was to chase away the gloomy thoughts and spend lonely evenings within the four walls. The house was not home without her husband. Sighing heavily, Ashley ate dinner without appetite and sat down in front of the TV. The cheerful faces on the screen were accompanied by upbeat music. It didn't make her heart feel any better. The log cabin by the lake was a happy place. Jason and Alina, looking forward to 2 whole days of freedom and solitude, were in high spirits. The hostess came by and brought berries. "Have a good rest." Thanks to her, Jennifer Ann, Jason smiled as he hugged Alina. "My wife and I are very happy. We try to keep things in order." As soon as the hostess left, Alina laughed and playfully nudged Jason in the side. "Oh, you're with your wife too. What about Ashley? If she'd known, she'd have bitten her elbows." "Let her bite her elbows." Jason dismissed it with a nonchalance. "I told her I was going fishing with the men. So she believed me. She's an idiot." "Do you know how sneaky you are?" Alina pretended to be indignant. "And what am I then?" "An alternate airfield." "You're my queen," Jason said, pulling her to him. "The one and only. And Ashley's just a misunderstanding. You know, for status, we can't get divorced now that everything's worked out so well, can we?" The couple laughed merrily. Satisfied with their idea, Jason took Alina in his arms and spun her around the room, kissing her face and neck. She squealed with delight and fought back. The lovers decided to go swimming. The lake was cool and quiet. The scent of pine needles wafted in the air. Jason and Alina, holding hands, walked leisurely along the shore, anticipating how they would plunge into the clear surface and then lounge in the sun, sipping cold wine. Beauty. But the idyll was suddenly broken by an unexpected boy's voice. "Hey, are you here to fish too?" Jason turned around irritably at the sound. At the water's edge, right in front of their house, was a boy of about 10. He was sitting on an overturned bucket with an old fishing rod in his hands, staring curiously at the couple. "Hey kid, what are you doing here?" Jason frowned. "Trespassing on private property without permission." "With a permit," the boy said cheerfully. "I've been fishing here every day for the summer. Jennifer Ann says it's okay. She says you can come anytime and there's plenty of room for everyone." Jason whistled. "That's quite a room. They didn't need a witness in here either. The kid might see something he didn't want to see, and then he'd spread the word. It's a rumor mill." "How's the bite?" Jason decided to turn his anger on Jason. "Sure," as the boy nodded happily. "Grandma's got it," Alina said with a sympathetic click of her tongue. He was such a little orphan, but he already had a lot to worry about. Not like some of the others, I'm sorry to say. Jason was embarrassed too, but for a different reason. He didn't like all that snotty charity. There was nothing to be sorry about. He's feeding his grandmother. He's used to being handed everything on a platter by other people's uncles and aunts. "Listen, kid," he began resolutely. "Couldn't you fish somewhere else? It's awkward. People have come to rest, and here you are with your fishing rods. There's plenty of room. Look for a free place." The boy clapped his eyes in surprise. "I always fish here. It's the best place. Big fish are coming. In other places there are only small fish. Not enough for soup." "It's better than this," Jason began to boil. "What are you getting so worked up about? We're looking for privacy, romance, and you're right here. Get out of here." The boy shrank back and fell silent. Big tears ran down his cheeks. He got up without complaint, picked up his fishing rod, and tried to walk away, hanging his head. "Jason, what are you really doing?" Alina said reproachfully. The baby wasn't bothering anyone at all. "Oh, the baby's taking it." Jason teased her. "Now there are dozens of transgressions." "Then I didn't dare. I don't need a daycare center in my neighborhood." "Well, think about it." He turned and strode toward the house. On the way, he put his arm around Alina's shoulders. She glanced guiltily at the boy she liked, but obediently followed his lover. Jason knew better than she did, and he wouldn't advise her to do anything wrong. She sobbed with resentment. Walking down the dusty path with his fishing rods, tears welled up in my eyes. All sorts of bitter thoughts came into my head. Why did that uncle pick on him? So what? A rich man spoke out. He probably has no children himself, so he doesn't understand anything. If his mother were alive, he wouldn't have to go around looking for food. Grandma's lost it lately, so he's got to get around. At first, Aiden wanted to wait for the bus at the bus stop nearby, but then he decided that it was better to walk. It was only an hour later, and the boy sighed and walked along the road, occasionally wiping his wet cheeks. The fishing line was trying to get away, but what did it matter now? The sun had long since risen by the time Aiden reached his yard. With a heavy heart, he climbed up to the third floor of the old Khrushchevka and timidly turned the key in the lock. Grandmother Barbara Adamson was waiting for him, as always, in a chair by the window. "See, he's back," she rejoiced, spilling out her wrinkles with her clean hands. "So how was fishing today?" The boy sighed heavily and lowered his eyes. "Caught nothing. I was chased away from the lake. They said I was disturbing the rest, you see. And in other places there are only small fish, but it's a shame to even catch them." Grandma sighed sympathetically. "Oh, my onion sorrow. And who was so heartfelt to speak out?" "Some rich man," with a girl, Aiden said. "They've rented Jennifer Ann's house, but it's all right, don't mind them." His grandmother consoled him. "God will judge them. Unscrupulous. It's not your fault. You're a good boy, you look after me, you're growing up to be a provider. You'll see there'll be a holiday on our street." Meanwhile, she sighed and got up from the chair and went to the kitchen in her shabby slippers. "Let's go and eat what God sent us. I made potatoes and pickles in a pickle. Now we'll fight until you go fishing again on Monday. If you come early, you might catch something, before the tourists come." Aiden nodded obediently and followed his grandmother, dragging his unfortunate fishing rods behind him. Maybe tomorrow would be a better day. In the meantime, potatoes and cucumbers. She herself better not lie down on an empty stomach, or her guts will play all night long. If only Mom were alive. What can I say now? Despite her best efforts, Ashley's thoughts kept returning to Jason and his mysterious fishing trip. It had been almost 24 hours, and she hadn't heard a word from him. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. Maybe he's out with his friends and he's having a blast. She's been worried sick. At some point, when there weren't many customers, Ashley couldn't stand it and decided to call her husband. It was ringing, but no one was picking up. She stubbornly called again and again until she heard her husband's cheerful voice. "Hello. Why are you calling so persistently? I told you we're almost out." "Jason, do you even know that I'm okay?" Ashley begged. "I'm freaking out here. What if something happened?" "Oh, come on, Ashley," he said nonchalantly. "We're fine. Did you have a great time fishing?" "Oh, it was great. We're getting ready to go home." Good, Ashley sighed, trying to suppress a bitter resentment. "You get some rest too. I'm looking forward to seeing you." "Okay, kisses," Jason said cheerfully and passed out. Ashley glanced at the silent phone. She had no choice but to wait and hope for the best. Jason grinned and tucked his smartphone into his pocket. He wasn't on the lake shore at that moment, but in a fish store. Jason was choosing the right fish for disguise. What kind of stuff? The good stuff. He admired it, pointing his finger at the counter. You'd be hard-pressed not to take a beauty like this. It's good for booty. He bagged a couple of pieces. The saleswoman nodded, hiding a smile. She knew very well that these fish were not from the lake, but from the local farm. But the customer is always right if he pays. Why would a man want fish? It's obvious. It's a long-established pattern. Jason paid, and on his way out he almost knocked over a kid. "Be careful, kid," the man said. "Are you going to hurt someone else?" The boy's head snapped up and Jason gasped in surprise. It was the same Aiden from the lake, the little brat who'd just recently had to be reprimanded for his curiosity. Aiden recognized his assailant too and froze with his mouth hanging open. But then his gaze fell on the bag in Jason's hands, and his eyes squinted suspiciously. "Weren't you fishing?" "Uncle," he asked, perplexed. "Why would you buy it at the store?" "That's none of your business." Jason ventured, feeling the blood rush to his cheeks. "Didn't your grandmother teach you that you shouldn't pester grown-ups?" "I was just asking," he shrugged. "Why are you so angry?" Jason gritted his teeth. But he didn't say anything, waved his hand at the boy, and walked out of the store, slamming the door. What a truth teller. I don't want to start a rumor in town. I'd deal with him too. Jason got in the car and checked the fish first. 3 large silvery beauties, still bright-eyed. Good for bait. For proof of a successful fishing trip. The wife's bound to be curious about the results. Here's the trophy. On the way home, Jason imagined the touching story he'd tell Ashley. How he and the men had fished until dawn, then cooked soup over a fire. How they'd almost missed a catfish like this. It's a beauty. You'll see that the scope of his stories will forgive his frequent absences. He's trying to make up for lost time. Jason came home in high spirits. Ashley was still gone. He breathed a sigh of relief and began to prepare for her arrival. First, he proudly placed the dead fish on a platter and in the refrigerator. Then he changed into his home clothes and poured whiskey into a glass for a bit of fun. I had to create the atmosphere of a hearty dinner. He sat down in the kitchen with his feet up and waited for his wife, figuring out where to begin his story. At that very moment, Ashley was scurrying between tables taking orders. It was a very crowded evening at the cafe. There was a lot of people in the cafe. Some demanded menus. Others complained about the cold coffee. Others were fussy, not knowing what to choose. Ashley could barely keep up with everyone. The receptionist also cast disapproving glances at her every now and then. She didn't smile enough, or she wasn't happy with the evening. Ashley breathed a sigh of relief when another guest appeared at the door. An old woman in a modest dress and shawl, looking around timidly. She was holding an old bag. Ashley gave her a friendly nod and hurried toward her. "Good afternoon. Please have a seat. Can I get you a menu?" "Hello, sweetheart," she smiled weakly at her grandmother. "No, I didn't come to eat. They say I need people here. I was wondering about a job." "A job?" Ashley was surprised. "You've never hired an older person to work in a cafe, have you? It's not easy for young people, and it's no place for them." "But I'm still strong," she nodded. "I can wash dishes, sweep the floor. I'd only need part-time work. I won't take much. It's hard to do it alone. At least I'll earn money for bread. I've got 1 grandson, and I'm with him. My name is Barbara Adamson." She was silent, and Ashley felt a lump in her throat. "Look at you, Grandma. I guess she's had enough of it if she's looking for a job in her old age. And it's not for the good." "Wait a minute." She nodded firmly. Ashley nodded, not hiding her relief. "That's good. Maybe it would work out. I have to raise my grandson and get him back on his feet. The pension is a pittance. How can you survive on it? In September, back to school. Textbooks, notebooks, again for Johnny. I need shoes of some kind." Meanwhile, Ashley made her way to the receptionist's office. "No, why? Can't we help Grandma out? At least let them do the dishes. It's not a lot of work, but she won't starve in her old age." "William Michael," she began firmly, approaching her superiors. "Here's the deal. Grandmother came to us asking for a job. She wants a part-time job washing dishes, scrubbing floors. Let's take it, shall we? It'll be a help after all." The administrator came in like a toothache. He looked questioningly at the arrived grandmother and shook his head. "What are you doing, Ashley? Where are we going to get this kind of staff? God forbid they die on the job or slip. You might as well answer for it." "No, I don't think so. Let him sit at home, get his pension and knit white socks. And we don't want anyone like that on the job." Ashley opened her mouth to object, but looked at her grandmother's tight lips. She couldn't work at her age, could she? It would be a waste of her health. Sighing, she waved her hands guiltily. Barbara Adamson bit her lip and nodded. She knew what she was doing. Who would want her? An old wreck. She'd dreamed it for a second. Well, it wouldn't be the first time. I'll move on somehow. "I'm sorry," Ashley muttered frustratedly as she came closer. "It's just not working out. The bosses don't like it. Maybe I should try somewhere else. I mean, it's a real mess around here, you know." "Thank you, my daughter," smiled sadly at her grandmother. "Thank you for your trouble. It's all right. I'll look for tenants." She was about to leave, but suddenly she realized. "Oh, honey, I'll tell you what. Why don't you come over for tea sometime?" "You're uncomfortable, aren't you?" Ashley was embarrassed. "Don't be embarrassed," her grandmother told her sternly. "I'm inviting you from the bottom of my heart." She dictated the street name and house number to Ashley and wrote it down on a piece of paper just in case. Then she got up from her chair and strode out, dragging her bag. Ashley stared after her, biting her lip. But what kind of life was this? She slammed her towel down on the counter in frustration and went back to her work. There was no need to write up the case. It was still a lot of work. But what about Grandma now? What will she live on? Would she really have to go begging? Ashley yanked her apron up and ran after her grandmother, catching up with her at the exit and taking her by the hand. "Wait, Grandma, why don't you come back tomorrow? It's just today is a mess. You see, the bosses are on edge, and tomorrow the owner will be Linda Paul. She's kind, so I'm hoping she'll be understanding. I'll explain everything to her and ask her for any job we can find for you." Barbara Adamson shook her head incredulously. "No way, honey. Only to embarrass myself once again in front of the big bosses." "Oh, come on." Ashley shook her head. "I've got hands and feet and a good head. What are you, not an employee? What time can you be here tomorrow? I'll meet you there, okay?" Grandma exclaimed and hugged Ashley. "Thank you, my daughter. I'll never forget your kindness. God bless you." "Well, God bless you." Ashley was embarrassed. "Run along and we'll talk tomorrow." Granny nodded and hurried out the door. Ashley felt a lump come up in her throat. It was like that you lived your life and there was no one to help you. It's good if kind people come along and lend a hand. And if not. Before she could finish this thought, the door of the cafe opened again. On the threshold stood the old boy with fishing rods. "Hello," he smiled shyly, shuffling from foot to foot. "Didn't you have my grandmother here? Such an old one, in a shawl?" Yes, Ashley nodded. "She just left. You? Aiden, you must be the boy shining?" "I, Aiden? How do you know?" "Grandma, your job was looking for you," Ashley sighed. "But it didn't work out. The bosses are against it." Aiden, panic. Head down, she's understandably desperate. She said, "I'll go anywhere. As long as I can earn my bread." It's hard on her and me, you know. Ashley pressed her lips together sympathetically. It's not easy, but you're doing great. You go to school and help your grandmother. And your parents? At the mention of his parents, Aiden shrank back and looked away. They're gone. They're dead. I don't remember them much anymore. It's just me and my grandmother. She looks after me. Ashley's heart ached. It was a terrible thing to be orphaned at that age. At least her grandmother had the strength to raise her grandson. And now he's looking for a part-time job in his old age. Their life. She gave Aiden a reassuring pat on the head. But don't worry, it'll work out somehow. I told grandmother to come tomorrow. The boy nodded gratefully. Thank you. You can't imagine. We need all the help we can get right now. I'll help Grandma come to you tomorrow. He smiled shyly and turned to leave. Ashley's cell phone rang loudly in her pocket. She apologized and reached for the phone. The screen showed a picture of Jason, tanned, smiling, holding a huge carp. Aiden slid his eyes over the display and then froze, his eyes rounding. Oh, I know that. He was fishing on our lake. Well, as fishing, he chased me away from a good place. And then he bought a whole bag of fish at the store. Ashley blinked. What are you talking about? What lake? My husband was going fishing with his friends and they fished there themselves. Why would you buy it at the store? Aiden threw up his hands. I don't know, but I definitely saw it both at the lake and in the store. Then I wondered why I'd drop it at night and go to the store. Ashley felt the heat rising to her cheeks. What the hell was that kid talking about Jason? Like he was suddenly buying fish at the store. That can't be true. He's never taken a big fish. That's how he catches them. Aiden must have gotten it wrong. Or maybe he's mistaken. She resolutely dismissed the stupid thought and disconnected the call. Come on, I need to hear you out. You're so worried, poor guy. You must be mistaken, sweetheart, Ashley said softly. My husband doesn't store at stores. He's a fisherman. Look at the trophies he brings home. She turned the screen of the phone toward the boy and jabbed her finger at the picture, but Aiden shook his head stubbornly. No, I'm not mistaken, I'm telling you. It's him. I saw him at the lake and at the store. I remember him. He was big, bald, and had a loud voice. He scolded me and chased me off the shore, and he was there with a net. Something inside Ashley just snapped. It's a perfect match. The height, the build, the baldness. It's definitely him. He's got a temper. He's never satisfied. So he hasn't been fishing all this time? The phone beeped again. Ashley glanced at the screen. Her husband must have waited, poor thing. Gritting her teeth, she dropped the call and turned to the boy. He was staring at her, guilty and confused, as if he were not happy that the truth had come out of his mouth. Thank you, Ashley forcefully said. I think you've opened my eyes. I shouldn't have trusted that liar for so many years. But he's not going to get his fishing trip back tonight. Oh, really? The boy was scared. I didn't mean to upset you. Maybe I really mixed up. But there are such people, bald, angry. How many of them are there? No, good for you, Ashley smiled sadly. You can't run away from the truth. It's about time you opened your eyes. I believed it for so many years. But I'll get over it. I'll tell you what, run along. Don't be upset about anything. The next day you'll come together and we'll look for a job for you. Aiden nodded sullenly and wandered toward the door. He felt tormented. It was as if he'd told the truth, but it didn't make him feel any better. He'd upset such a good aunt, destroyed her faith in her husband. Maybe he shouldn't have opened his mouth in the first place. If he'd kept his mouth shut, everything would have stayed the same. Who knew? Ashley stood in the middle of the room, staring blankly at one point. Her mind was filled with angry, bitter, desperate thoughts. How could it be? But how dare he fool her for so long, make a fool of her in front of everyone? Who does he take her for? A fool, no other way. The phone was ringing incessantly. The husband must have sensed something wrong. It's understandable he's already come back from fishing and his wife isn't home. Suspected something. Nothing. Let her be nervous enough. I've already danced on her nerves. No more. Ashley picked up her bag and headed for the exit. Enough. She was going to deal with this cheater, and she was going to tell him what was on her mind once and for all. And then she would see. After all, it was not on this mess brood, it's not her to clean it up. With these thoughts, she left the cafe without looking back. A difficult conversation and complete uncertainty awaited her. But one thing Ashley knew for sure was that she wasn't going to live with the same old lies and innuendo. At first, she'd wanted to calm down, enter the apartment with a nonchalant air, question Jason, and listen intently to how he'd handle it. And then make a scene, nail him to the wall with hard facts. See if I could nail him to the wall. But as soon as Jason's cheerful face appeared on the doorstep, Ashley burst into tears. All the resentment, all the suspicion, came rushing out in an unstoppable flood. You're a liar? You scoundrel. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think you'd keep telling me lies? I know where you've been and who you've been with. Jason stood frozen in place, mouth open like a fish. He was still clutching the bouquet. I guess he'd saved it for his wife. But now the flowers looked pathetic, not touching. Honey, what are you doing? He squeezed out, flapping his eyes incomprehensibly. What fly bit you? I was fishing, you know. I brought back a catch. He nodded at the impressive carp on a platter in the middle of the table. I'd taken them out of the refrigerator ahead of time. A catch? What do you mean? Ashley snorted dismissively. I know all about your fishing now. What lake were you on? What mermaid did you have fun with? What a fisherman you are. All you can do is stick your rod in other people's holes. Jason's eyebrows went up in surprise. Honey, what are you talking about? What mermaids? What whirlpool? I'm in there with men. With men. Don't be ridiculous, Ashley laughed evilly. They saw you at the lake. Not with men, but with a girl. You were having fun with her and making me look like a fool. And then you went to the store and bought some fish to distract me. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Jason staggered backward. His mind raced with thoughts, one more ridiculous than the next. Who could have seen him? Could it have been Jennifer Ann, the owner of the vacation home, or a random passerby from the lake? He'd thought it all out so carefully, he couldn't have gotten it wrong. And there didn't seem to be anyone in the store. Wait, what about the kid? But the kid couldn't have ratted him out. Or could he? As Ashley watched her husband fretting, it only made her angrier. What? You didn't expect me to find out? Were you thinking of ways to get out of it? It's too late, honey. You can't get away with it now. I know everything. I've had enough of your lies. I don't want to be a laughingstock anymore. She snatched her sweater off the rack and headed for the door. Jason finally came to his senses and rushed out the door. Ashley, wait, you're... I'm sorry. I was out with some friends. We had a little fun with these girls. But it's not serious. You're my wife, and you're the only one I love. Ashley paused, brushing aside his annihilating stare. Love. If you loved me, you wouldn't go out with me. That's it, no more games. I can't do this anymore. I don't want to, and I won't. Goodbye. She resolutely swung the door open and stepped out into the stairwell. Her husband jumped out next, trying to hold her by the elbow. Ashley, where are you going? Out for the night? Come back and we'll talk. Well, you want me to get on my knees? Ashley pulled away from him like fire. No thanks. It's a deal already. And you're probably used to kneeling in front of that mermaid of yours, aren't you? I don't want to see or hear from you again. Go to her. Shaking the elbow of her husband's hand, Ashley ran down the stairs. Jason froze on the landing, confused and angry at the same time. But I should have done something so stupid. The police are what he needs. That little kid. But wait, puppy. Meanwhile, Ashley was flying down the dark streets, unable to see the road. Tears filled her eyes. Resentment was tearing her chest apart. Where to now? Not to spend the night on the street, really. It is shameful to go to acquaintances, they will laugh. And there's no chance of gossip. Suddenly, she remembered Barbara Adamson's words about lodgers. Her grandmother had said she'd like to rent out a room. What if she'd be willing to stay for a couple days? I mean, she's got nowhere else to go, and Ashley won't be in debt. She'll pay me back. She wandered around the courtyard a bit, found the right doorway, and timidly rang the bell. The door opened, and behind her stood Aiden in his pajamas, yawning. "Oh, Aunt Ashley, what are you doing here? So late, did something happen?" Ashley replied, embarrassed. "I'm in trouble. I had a fight with my husband and left home. I have nowhere to go. I'm going to sleep at the train station. Maybe your grandmother will let you stay for a couple of nights? I'll pay whatever you say." "Alas, what's the matter with you?" The boy splashed his hands. "Of course, stay with us, grandmother. She will gladly accept. Good people are always welcome. Come in, we'll warm your tea." He fussed, running around the apartment, and at the noise his grandmother looked out of the room. When she saw Ashley, she shook her hands. "Jesus, Ashley, what the hell happened to you last night?" Ashley sobbed and told her of her trouble. Granny shook her head, clucked, and clasped her hands to her chest. "Oh, I'm not a city. What kind of men are they nowadays? No shame, no conscience. You, my dear, don't kill yourself. Stay with us as long as you need. There's not much room, but at first we can accommodate you on a cot, and then we'll see." "Thank you, Barbara Adamson," Ashley smiled through her tears. "Only I'm not just for nothing. I'm going to pay. I've got the money. It'll be enough for the first time." What are you? The landlady waved her hands. "No money at all. It's not like we're going to be strangers, Grandma Barb." Ashley started to argue, proving that she didn't want to sit on the old woman's neck. Granny suddenly realized, "Listen, honey, you said you'd talk to the landlady about me. Maybe they'll hire me at least part-time. Do you think they'd take an old woman?" Ashley was embarrassed for a moment, but then she said, "Oh, Grandma Barb, I don't know. It's so busy in there now. You can see for yourself, and our bosses, God forbid, will eat you up. They'll never let you work with an angry belly. Maybe you shouldn't come to us after all." "Do I see?" Grandma sighed. "So I see you're trying your best." Grandmother frowned, but upon reflection nodded. That's true. How can I compete with the young? I am an old woman. Who will take care of him if I go to work for a pittance? He's already an orphan. I don't want to be a burden to him. Let him study. Let him go out into the world in peace." Ashley rushed to hug her grandmother. "It's okay. We'll get through this. We'll be each other's backbone." Somehow she sobbed again. Barbara Adamson stroked her head. A heartbroken Ashley cried even more. Now with gratitude. That's what people are like. People in need but willing to give their shirt off their back. No, what some people. In the meantime, Vidite Postered had brought blankets and pillows into the hall. He laid down next to me on an old mattress to dry off. "Ashley, don't be shy. If you need anything, tell me." She stroked his head, barely holding back the incoming tears. It was a shame she'd spent so many years thinking she had no one in the world but her husband. But how many kind people around and ready to help, to support in a difficult moment. A little while later, Anne fell into a troubled sleep. She dreamed something cloudy, heavy, as if someone dragged her into a dark pool, pulling her to the bottom, and there was no way to get out. And from somewhere she heard a familiar voice, "Ashley, what were you thinking? What about me?" But Ashley just waved it off, swam on and on. That's it, that's enough. She's going to listen to more scoundrels. Her life was in her hands now, and there was no way she was going to let anyone lead her astray again. She continued to work in the cafe, trying not to think about the recent upheaval. Her husband, on the other hand, was tearing up. He obviously did not expect his wife to pull such a trick and run away from home. A divorce was definitely not in his plans. The reason was simple: Jason had an important negotiation looming, where he had to appear with his wife. And the catch was that the partners had known Ashley by sight for a long time. Jason couldn't take his mistress with him. It would immediately raise more unnecessary questions and ruin the whole deal. Finally, Jason took the desperate step of going to Ashley's office and begging for help. "Ashley, help me out," he smiled ingratiatingly, trying to catch her eye. "Well, come negotiate with me once and I won't touch you again, I swear." And the divorce was finalized without a problem. Well, if that's the way you want it. At first, she flatly refused. She'd had enough of this circus. She'd been humiliated and would never again go along with a cheating liar. "I don't want to," she said. "You've made a mess of it. You're the one who has to clean it up. I'm not playing that game anymore." But Jason wasn't going to give up so easily. He called the cafeteria manager aside and whispered fervently to him, nodding to his wife every now and then. She heard bits and pieces of phrases ... "thank you" in a royal way. Give her a fun life, so she doesn't have to do any more. The administrator was a good guy. He knew it was a good money deal. He nodded enthusiastically. Well, Ashley's in trouble now. She's going to have some serious problems at work. And sure enough, the very next day, the receptionist called her on the carpet. And from the get-go, he said, "What's the matter, sweetheart?" At your mercy, the client left the restaurant, not finished and not paid. He says they brought a bad dish. The waitress apparently spit on the way out and had to pay a fine for spoiled food and moral damages. Ashley was speechless at that statement. "What are you talking about? What customer? What damages? I didn't spit. I did everything as usual." But how could she prove it? The receptionist had all the cards in his hand. He threatened to take it out of her paycheck if she persisted. Gave Ashley a hefty fine. Just hang in there. You can see why he's doing what he's doing, why he's doing what he's told. But if you try to resent him, you'll be out of a job. There was no end to the abuse in the days that followed. She gave the wrong napkins. She didn't smile enough, and the receptionist did what he wanted, feeling Jason's support behind him. And the goal was the same: to force Ashley to give in and agree to the unfortunate negotiations. And to top it all off, Anne felt sick, dizzy and sick to her stomach. Ashley couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. Suddenly she remembered how in the morning she had grabbed a salad on the run. Although Ashley usually avoided eating at cafes, low prestige dishes of poor quality could be caught, and they didn't care much about cleanliness in the kitchen, but not to the point of whimsy, when you go all the way just to serve the customers with a smile. Is it poisoned? Ashley thought anxiously, listening to the unpleasant sensations. But what a nuisance. She had a lot on her plate, and now her health was acting up. Ashley continued to move between the tables, trying to fight the discomfort. But she didn't think she could hold on much longer. She was going to collapse unconscious in the middle of the room. Something had to be done, something to get out of this ridiculous situation. Finally, exhausted and desperate, Ashley gave up. "After all, why am I going to go through with this stupid negotiation?" she said. "I'll smile once for the record, but then I'll be free of my debts and my hated marriage. It's worth it." "God be with you." She exhaled tiredly, bumping into Jason at the door. "I'll go once, but it'll be the first and last time. Don't involve me in any more of your scams." Her ex-husband grinned triumphantly and nodded readily. Sure, he said. "Everything will be fine. I promise. You'll put on your best dresses, you'll shine, you'll be charming, and then we'll sign a contract and we'll get a divorce. Good for everyone." Ashley sighed, but didn't object. After all, there was nothing to lose. It couldn't get any worse. That evening, she and Jason went to a business dinner at a fancy restaurant in the center of town. Ashley was curious about it. She'd never been to a restaurant like that before. I wonder what it's like for the rich, she thought. It must be all manners and curtsy, not unlike our diner. As soon as they stepped inside, Ashley felt her head spinning again. Nausea was coming up her throat, and her eyes were dark. I should have stayed home for a day instead of going out tonight, she thought. Ashley, what's wrong? Jason asked her worriedly, noticing her pale face. Are you sick or something? No, I'm fine, she said weakly. It'll pass. You go on back to the table and meet your bumps. Jason gave her an incredulous look, but didn't argue. He didn't want to lose his authority in front of his business partners. He escorted his wife to the lavishly laid table and introduced her to the crowd. Ashley put a social smile on her face, trying not to show how badly she felt. She had to hold it together for a little while longer, and then it would be up to her. But suddenly it struck her that Jason hadn't said a word about what the negotiations were about. She'd been wondering if her husband was in business, making important deals. But what if there was something fishy going on? What if he was dragging her into some kind of scam, and then he'd go into the bushes? The thought made Ashley break out in a cold sweat. Or was it just the malaise? Try to figure it out now. Meanwhile, the evening was gaining momentum. The guests were talking animatedly, champagne glasses were clinking, and there were bursts of laughter. Ashley felt completely shattered. Her head was pounding and her throat felt nauseous. I think I should run to the ladies' room, she thought. Ashley rose carefully from the table. She whispered to Jason that she'd be gone for a while. His eyes flashed with annoyance, but he didn't object. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. Ashley made her way to the bathroom and leaned against the wall. What the hell is wrong with this? She thought. I can't get any peace in here. I'm dizzy and my ears are ringing. I must have poisoned myself. But what kind of fool would take expired food? William Michael, who else? Anyway, it wasn't about that right now. The main thing was to get through the night. And then we'll see. Let's not embarrass ourselves in front of the guests. Ashley made an effort to wash her face with cold water and headed back. No way, she thought. I'm not going to give Jason that pleasure. I'm going to smile through my tears, but I'm not going to let him win. One step, another. Damn heels. Who the hell invented heels? I should have worn sneakers and ignored the etiquette. Ashley entered the ballroom. Suddenly, Paul swayed and sprinted toward her. Before she could even realize it, her eyes went black and her knees buckled. The last thing she saw was the twisted face of her husband. And then the world turned upside down and went out. That was the end of the party. And the negotiation was over too, and maybe the rest of my life. The thought flashed through Ashley's fading mind a moment before she was swallowed by the blissful, salvific darkness. There, in the darkness, there was no pain, no bitterness, no disappointment. There, no one lied to her, no one betrayed her, no one forced her to dance to someone else's tune. There she was free at last. And even in her half-sleep, that darkness glimmered. Ashley clutched the scrap of paper with her grandmother and Aiden's address in her hand, a thread to hold on to, a thin ray of hope to keep her from giving up. Ashley fainted as panic swept through the room. Guests were jumping up and down from the table, talking loudly, speculating. Someone was already reaching for the phone to call an ambulance. Jason rushed around his wife, slapping her cheeks or clutching her head. So much for the deal. The whole thing had gone down the drain because of that fool. It had to fall apart in such a bad way, he lamented. Meanwhile, one of Red's companions, a man of about 45, took matters into his own hands. He unceremoniously pushed Jason away and leaned over Ashley, feeling for a pulse. Okay, she's got a pulse, but it's weak. "We need an ambulance," he gestured to the waiter and gave him clear instructions. "Call. Kid, tell him she's unconscious. We'll let them in here like a fire." The waiter nodded and rushed to the phone. The businessman turned to Jason, giving him a hard look. "What kind of show is this, if you don't mind me asking? Why did you bring us here?" "I don't know what got into her," Jason excused himself. "She'd been fine this morning. Maybe she was nervous. It was a delicate matter. "Yes, William," Michael flared angrily. "Why did you come to negotiate with a woman at all? This is not the way we agreed. This isn't a picnic with jokes, this is a serious deal." Jason shrank under the humiliating stare, not knowing what to say. Obviously, he'd been hoping to make a show of it. Make himself look good. "Look at my wife, a real smart and beautiful woman. And she fainted in front of the whole company." While the two men were arguing, the paramedics rushed in. They took a quick look at Ashley and loaded her onto a gurney and wheeled her away. Jason stood there, staring helplessly at them. What now? The contract was off, his wife was in the hospital, and his companions were watching him like wolves. Shame on the whole town. William Michael squeamishly brushed off, as if flicking a speck of dust off his jacket. Red with indignation, he turned to Jason. "All right, sir, you've set me up big time. I'm not used to being made a laughingstock. So you can kiss your contract goodbye. We won't stand for that." Not this. Jason felt the ground slipping from under his feet. He'd made so many plans, so many hopes for this deal. How was he supposed to get out of it? Who should he fall at his feet to forgive? But the companion was inexorable. Angrily flashing his eyes, he turned abruptly and left the restaurant accompanied by the other businessmen. Their impenetrable faces showed that there was no turning back. Jason had screwed up too badly. Left all alone, he slumped in his chair and covered his face with his hands. What was this obsession? How could he have fallen for Ashley like that? He knew how important this meeting was to him. But he'd get even with her. She's the reason he's in the mess he's in now. He's lost his deal and his credibility. Meanwhile, Ashley was in the hospital room. Her head was pounding and her mouth tasted foul. Her whole body was broken, as if from a long illness. She struggled to get up on her elbows and looked around. Where was she? The last thing that came to mind was that she was in a restaurant. Some people, negotiations, and then failure. At that moment, a doctor entered the room, an elderly, tired-looking man in glasses and a white coat. He glanced at some papers on a clipboard, then looked at Ashley carefully over his glasses. "You awake? Welcome back, so to speak. Fainting in the middle of a banquet is serious," he said. Ashley replied with an embarrassed frown. "I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. I guess I was nervous. It's never happened to me before. I embarrassed my husband and scared people." "But don't worry so much," the doctor smiled encouragingly. "Anything can happen. You are now the main thing to think about yourself. And about the baby, of course." "Who?" Ashley was stunned. "About what, doctor?" The doctor squinted and paused for a moment. "What? Your future child? Didn't you know? You're pregnant. 6 weeks, already started toxicosis, so you fell down. But don't be upset, it's normal. The important thing is to take care of each other." Ashley froze, staring at the doctor with widened eyes. Pregnancy? That was the last thing she needed. And it was Jason's, but no one else. What do I do now? I mean, he's not going to want to hear about any baby. That's what he's like. All he does is worry about his own business and change mistresses like a glove. What's he want with children now? They're not aristocrats. Husbands, no support. Noticing the patient's confusion, the doctor patted her hand reassuringly. "You do not worry. While you rest, gain strength. Thinking about bad things is bad for you and the baby. You will be discharged in a couple of days, and then we will discuss a plan of action. Maybe we'll get your husband involved." After all, the baby's father should take care of you. Ashley nodded weakly, unable to say a word. If the doctor only knew how much Jason needed that care like a fish needed an umbrella. He'd kill himself before he'd admit he was a father. He'd probably run off to his mistress by now, the parasite. As if to confirm her thought, the door of the room opened. Her husband stood there, red with anger, his eyes blazing. Ashley squirmed, waiting for the storm. "You've ruined everything, you bitch," he yelled from the doorway. "You made me lose my pants. Do you realize what this contract cost me? You blew my best contract." "I'm sorry, I really didn't mean it," Ashley mumbled. "You set this whole thing up on purpose to screw me over. But wait till I get my hands on you." The shocked doctor intervened. "May I ask how you talk to your wife? She shouldn't be nervous. She's pregnant. You'd better be happy. You're about to become a father." Jason choked with indignation. "What father? What are you talking about? I can't have any children with that thing." He glared at his wife, who was huddled in the pillows. "We get rid of it fast. You got it? Are you going to get an abortion? Like it or not, I'm going free. I'm going to live with Alexa. What do you want?" "How can you do that?" Ashley cried through her tears. "It's our baby." "I won't let you do it," he hissed ominously. "Either you do as I say, or you're on your own, no money, no place to live, no nothing. And don't come home. Don't ask, I'll throw you out on the street and I won't look that you're pregnant. That's it," I said. With those words, he headed resolutely for the door. Ashley stared at him in despair, unable to say a word. Was this really the end? Would she be left alone, destitute, homeless, without a roof over her head? And where would she raise her child? And how? The doctor sympathetically shook his head and paternally put his arm around her shoulders. "Do not cry. We'll think of something. After all, you're not the first, you're not the last." But Ashley wasn't listening. Tears were silently streaming down her cheeks, and her lips were trembling. If only she'd known where her marriage would lead. What to do with all this now? She had to spend almost 2 weeks in the hospital. Her condition was unstable, then it went away. Then it was back to twisting and seizures. Ashley was transferred to the Department of Pathology of Pregnancy, leaving there under strict supervision. The days dragged on for an agonizingly long time, and there was no one to visit her. Her husband was gone. There were no relatives left in the city. But one day, an unexpected visitor appeared in the ward. Aiden. Shyly slipping through the door, the boy smiled shyly. "Hello, Aunt Ashley. I've come to check on you. How are you feeling?" She raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Aiden, how did you find me? And shouldn't you be at school right now instead of running around hospitals?" Aiden frowned in embarrassment. "My grandmother and I were worried. We thought, what if something happened? So we started calling hospitals." He handed Ashley a bag of goodies. "Here's some cookies, homemade candy. Grandma gave them to him. She said to eat them for your health." Ashley smiled through her tears. Another visitor entered the room, Jason's companion, William Michael. Ashley was embarrassed, not knowing how to react. Was he here to tell her off for the deal she'd blown? But the businessman smiled, looking at her warmly. "Ashley, good afternoon. Are you feeling better? I'm sorry to drop by you unannounced. I didn't want to worry you too much." "Hello, William Michael," Ashley said, confused. "And you are? Are you here to see me about the contract? But I..." "Oh, come on," the businessman said. "What contract now? That's it, the train's gone. You'd better think about your health. Especially in your position," he winked conspiratorially. "I didn't just drop by. I wanted to thank you personally. If you hadn't fainted, I'd be in debt up to my eyeballs. Jason was trying to set me up, He'd have gotten out of it on his own and eaten me alive. And then bam, and it all fell apart. You saved me from bankruptcy. Ashley's eyes widened in disbelief. I didn't do it on purpose. It just kind of happened on its own. The baby. Well, thank God it did, William Michael said. Well, I mean, of course, do not blame yourself. You did the right thing. Oh my gosh, what am I talking about? Anyway, Jason's an asshole. He's a real asshole. Well, he's gonna have a lot of fun in court. For fraud and deception. He's nothing to you now. You're free. Ashley's tears of relief. Wow. She'd thought all businessmen were in it together, one scumbag over another. But no, there are decent ones. At least someone understood her. Thank you, she said in a trembling voice. You have no idea how important it is to me. I feel like the last piece of trash. My husband's life ruined, your business almost ruined. Nonsense. Cut the businessman off. You are not guilty of anything, and baby, take care. He is definitely not involved in this, and everything will be fine. If necessary, I'll help with the work. He shook Ashley's hand reassuringly and stood up, nodding. Aiden, let me tell you something, he said with a sly wink. You're a good boy for coming. Come on, walk me to the exit. He obediently followed William Michael, telling him how he'd searched for Ashley and how he'd found her in the hospital. Left alone, Ashley leaned helplessly back against the pillow. Hundreds of thoughts swarmed in her head. What a turnaround. So it wasn't all bad. There were good people to lean on. Maybe she'll pull through. Start a new life without lies and humiliation. Just as long as the baby's okay. She'll never leave him, the only human being she has. Even if he was not conceived from great love, but still the dearest and most desirable. She'd do anything for him. She'd stay up all night and put up with hunger, just so long as the baby was born healthy. Ashley ran her hand over the polished belly, mentally addressing the future child. Hold on, baby. There are two of us now. We can handle everything. Just don't let me down. A week later, Ashley was discharged with a lot of recommendations and instructions, but she couldn't go to work right away. Doctors categorically forbade in her position to spend the whole day on her feet, and even with her toxemia. Any shaking and running was contraindicated. As the doctor walked her to the door of the hospital, he looked at Ashley sternly over his glasses. Look at me and forget about your cafe. You can't be a waitress yet. You can't risk your health. Find a quieter job, like working on a computer or on the phone. Or better yet, go on maternity leave. By God, you don't want to ruin the baby. Ashley nodded sullenly. Don't you dare object. Toxicosis is not something to be trifled with. Carrying a baby is a lot of work, and it's a lot of responsibility. She returned to the apartment of Kovitidi and his grandmother. But what to do? Money is tight. You can't live with acquaintances forever. You're ashamed of yourself. I should find a quiet job. You could just sit there and do paperwork while the kids are here. I have an idea suddenly struck Ashley over tea one evening. Remember William Michael promised to help? Maybe he has some kind of job opening? As a secretary or a dispatcher? I'm not bad at typing and I can answer the phone. What if he does? Grandma nodded approvingly. The day after she was discharged, Ashley, determined, dialed William Michael's number. He answered almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting for her call. Ashley, he said cheerfully. How are you feeling? Ashley smiled embarrassedly, blushing with pleasure. Wow, how thoughtful of him. And he remembers her situation, doesn't he? Thank you, William Michael. I'm slowly coming around, she sighed. Except I'm having trouble with work. The doctor says I can't go back to the cafe, and I need something to live on. Well, I promised to help, the businessman replied. I have an offer. Here's the thing. My mother is quite old, and she needs a nurse. It's not so much her health that she needs to be monitored, but just to talk to. Poor thing, she's going crazy with loneliness. Would you be willing to give it a try? The pay is decent. The hours are convenient and home-based, just what the doctor ordered. Ashley's heart jumped with joy. Here it is, a chance. And it's going to work out so well, and there'll be money. And I won't have to run around. And it's a good thing to help an old man. "Oh, William Michael, I'd love to," she exclaimed. "I can't thank you enough. You saved me." "Consider yourself hired," rejoiced the businessman. "Let me pick you up, take you to my mother, you get acquainted, talk, and at the same time we'll discuss all the nuances." "Yes, of course," Ashley exclaimed in disbelief. "I'll be there in a jiffy. Just tell me when." Within an hour, a happy and excited Ashley was sitting next to William Michael in his fancy car. Wow, how things are working out. Now it looks like Ashley's not going to lose her baby, and she's not going to starve herself. Meanwhile, the car was pulling up to a rich mansion on the outskirts of town. Ashley's breath was taken away by the luxury. William Michael personally escorted her to the door and helped her take off her coat. "Mother, welcome a guest. Our assistant has arrived, and my savior," he shouted into the back of the house. Footsteps came from the living room. A gaunt grandmother appeared on the doorstep with a shawl draped over her shoulders. Ashley took a welcoming step toward her, but suddenly froze in place. Her ears rumbled and her eyes darkened. It can't be. It just can't be. Standing before her was Aiden's grandmother, Barbara Adamson. "Ah," gasped Ashley. "Oh my God, how is this?" William Michael perplexedly shifted his gaze from the frozen mother to the dumbfounded Ashley. "But you've met Ashley? Who the hell is Barbara Adamson? Would someone please explain this to me?" Granny clutched at her shawl with trembling hands, keeping her eyes fixed on Ashley, who was frozen in amazement. "Barbara, my little sister." "Is she alive?" Ashley looked from mother to son in a stupor. She couldn't make sense of it. William Michael, Aiden's grandmother's nephew, the same one whose twin sister Anna had just met. There was no other explanation for the resemblance. They're twin sisters. "Well, wait, let me come to my senses," pleaded the businessman. The mother sits down in the chair. "Who's Barbara? Who are you talking about?" "Barbara, my dear sister," snapped grandmother, wiping her tears. "She and I grew up in an orphanage, and then we were separated, taken to different families. I didn't think I'd ever see her again." William Michael only shook his head in confusion. "I'm confused. Are you Sonia? Not Barbara? It's crazy." "Yes, Sonia, I am Sonia," Granny said hurriedly. Ashley's not thinking straight. Shocked, she looked from one to the other. "So you're saying that Grandma Barbara is your sister, and William Michael is her nephew, and Aiden is his nephew, only a cousin." "Aiden who?" the businessman asked in confusion. "That's the first I've heard." "So Barbara has a grandson?" Grandma Sonia guessed. The businessman slapped his forehead and jumped up to his mother. "See? Of course, it's the little boy who was at his grandmother's hospital." "You, Ashley, are you living here?" Yes, Ashley nodded. "And Mom's not going out alone now." William Michael exclaimed, "And your sister is here. And she has a grandson who's a nice little boy. And I'm his uncle. Wow, what a turnaround." He kissed the dazed mother with feeling, and then Gusty hugged Ashley. "Oh, Ashley, friends, so friends. I guess fate sent you to me for a reason. Now we're going to solve all your problems. It'll be more fun for Mom. And we won't let your Aiden get hurt, Ashley." And I was ready to burst with emotion. But look how things turned out. Not so long ago she was pining for a scoundrel of a husband, hiding, wondering how to raise a child. And now there's a family and a job and a roof over her head. Further merged into one happy whirlpool, ringing hugs, tears of joy. William Michael immediately gave orders to assistants to transport immediately grandmother Barbara to her in the mansion, to allocate rooms, do not deny anything. Already by evening everyone was gathered and happy, crying sisters, confused, smiling Aidan and sympathetic William Michael. All they could hear was Sonia, Barbara, Aunt Ashley, so you're going to live here now too. At one point Ashley had a funny thought, how would Jason react to all this? He'd probably choke on his anger at seeing his wife in a place like this, surrounded by people he loved. It would have been a number, but she shook off the unwelcome memory. And the scoundrel. He was nothing to her now. Let them go away with their mermaids. And this life promised to be truly happy. There would be enough space and care for everyone in the big house, the grandmothers, the sisters, the girl, and Ashley herself with the future baby. But the main thing was that there would be real relatives around, those who would not betray, but would support her in word and deed. And even though they don't know each other very well yet, it's a matter of time. The main thing is that now they have each other. Ashley felt dizzy. She staggered to her feet, leaned on the outstretched hand, and glanced at her savior, William Michael. He was looking at her with genuine tenderness, adoration, even as if he were the eighth wonder of the world. Ashley was embarrassed, blushing, but the next moment she felt herself being pressed gently against a safe, strong shoulder. A determined whisper in her ear, Ashley, this is what I want to say. You're not just my savior anymore. You're the person I can't imagine my life without. And if you let me, if you think I'm worthy, well, I'd like to be a real support to you. A husband and a father to a child. Ashley listened to these confused confessions, feeling tears running down her cheeks, tears of relief and hope, the tears of a woman who had rediscovered her faith and love. Was it really true? Was it not a dream? That old life was behind her. And Jason was destined for the fate of all liars and traitors. When he lost his wife, he lost his last chance for redemption and traded it for cheap pleasure, for the ghostly excitement of gambling. Well, it's his own fault. It was too late to bite his elbows now. Ashley allowed herself to be drawn into the circle of rejoicing relatives, where Grandma Barbara Adamson and Grandma Sonja hugged, never tiring of saying, "Cease of my blood," where Aidan galloped with delight, eyes shining. And such a phenomenon as a weekend in Emily's life did not happen too often, but she had prepared so that exactly on this day to be able to not work. But she didn't say anything. She decided to surprise him. The boy would be home from school, and the table would be set, and the modest apartment would be decorated, and the gift would be ready, and his mother would be home, which of course was important. It was her Jason's 15th birthday. He was all grown up now. Thinking about it, Emily let a tear fall. Grown up, except that the festive mood hadn't completely faded, but somehow the sad memory never made her feel fully happy, especially now. After all, on the same clear sunny day exactly 4 years ago, she was waiting for her son. True, not from school, but from the gymnastics section. Just like today, he had no idea that his mother had decided to surprise him. Just like that, she cleaned the house, hung balloons, cut salads, and carefully wrapped the gift. I even bought the exact same cake as his favorite. And just about the time Jason was supposed to finish class and head to the locker room, Emily's phone rang. When she looked at the screen, she was surprised to find her son's coach on the other end of the line. The thought flashed through her mind. Why didn't he call himself? Anxiety was slowly creeping into her heart. But it was still light, superficial, like any phenomenon that was out of the usual order of things. When she answered, her voice sounded calm, even with a hint of the cheerful mood she had been in all day. "Hello, Patrick Gregory," she said. "Hello, Emily." The coach's voice greeted her, and already from his intonation she realized that something was wrong. The man spoke nervously, excitedly, though his words seemed designed to assure Jason's mom that nothing was wrong. "You see, we're having a little trouble with Jason. Nothing serious, I guess. He took a bad fall while practicing an element, hurt his leg. I suspect it's just a sprain, but of course we called an ambulance just in case. So much for nothing serious, Emily thought gloomily. When nothing serious does not call an ambulance. Well, Coach knows how to spot that sort of thing. "I'll be right there," was all she said. It didn't take her long to get to the room where the class was held. It didn't take more than half an hour to get there on foot from her house, and it was only 10 minutes by bus. When Emily got there, the ambulance hadn't arrived yet. Jason was lying on one of the benches in the locker room. He was joking, laughing, and generally looked like he was just lying there because he felt like it. Emily could see in his eyes that he was hurt and scared. He just wasn't the kind of person, even at 15, to show it to everyone around him. "Oh." "Hi," Jason said, surprised. "I thought you were at work." "Even if I was, I would have come back when I heard you'd been injured. I'd have run right out of the operating room." Emily grinned against her will. She smiled at him. It occurred to her that, after all, if a man was acting like that, he wasn't dying, and everything else was fixable, one way or another. She gave her son a brief hug, and they waited together for the ambulance. Jason seemed to feel much better with his mother's arrival. Alas, the doctors at the hospital had nothing to cheer up the family. The leg injury was more serious than anyone had realized. Jason had only two options, either expensive surgery or conventional treatment, which would certainly put him back on his feet, but not completely. And he could definitely forget about any sports activities. Is it worth mentioning that the family had no money for the operation? Emily raised her son alone. His father, as it often happens, went out for bread when the boy was not even a year old. He never came back. His mother worked as a doctor in an ordinary city hospital. Obviously, it couldn't bring much income. It was enough to live on, but that's all. She couldn't even save anything. At first, Emily was just desperate. What's the use of being a doctor, she thought, if you can't help your own son? She really couldn't. A cardiac surgeon is an invaluable specialist, of course. It's hard to imagine how many complex heart surgeries she has performed. How many people were saved by her efforts, and how many grateful patients came to her later with flowers and candy. But she was powerless over her leg injury. Perhaps Emily could perform some elementary general surgery, but not the kind her son needed. She needed a real specialist, a professional. And she didn't have the knowledge or experience. Jason, on the other hand, was not discouraged. He had learned to be quite skillful with his bad leg. Sometimes he felt as if the limp didn't bother him at all. Of course it didn't. He missed his sports and the chance to just play ball in the yard with the other boys. Still, he believed that someday things would get better. Looking at her son, Emily gradually stopped getting discouraged. What was she doing? Really? Jason's not even a few years old yet, and he's holding up better than she is. It's not going to work. She had to pull herself together. And now, after 4 years, she only occasionally allowed herself to wallow in sad memories. Of course, only when her son wasn't around. A sudden sharp sound snapped her out of her memories. Emily didn't even immediately realize what had happened. She carefully put aside the knife she was using to cut vegetables for the salad and went to find the source of the noise. It was a phone call, and a cold sweat ran down her spine. For a while, she couldn't even bring herself to look at the screen. The situation was too similar. But the machine kept ringing, and Emily had to force herself. The caller's number was a complete stranger. Not without trepidation, she answered. Speaking. Hello, Emily. An unfamiliar male voice answered the phone. Hello, she answered politely. Who am I speaking to? My name is Patrick Gregory, the stranger introduced himself. I won't tell you my last name. I don't think it will tell you anything. It is enough for you to know that I am an entrepreneur, the owner of one of the, I will say without false modesty, very good private clinics. And it just so happens that we need an equally good heart surgeon. You. Emily mumbled in disbelief. "Are you trying to offer me a new job?" "Yes," Patrick Gregory said. "I want to offer you a job with a very, dare I say it, decent pay. You'll be able to buy a more decent place to live. And you'll be able to put your son in a good school. Plus, I'm willing to sponsor the boy's surgery. Make up your mind right away. You don't need to treat poor people anymore. City Hospital is totally out of your league." Emily didn't like that last part. What's that? If a person has no money, he doesn't deserve quality care. And in principle, the entrepreneur seemed to her not too pleasant person, arrogant, overconfident. It was better not to do business with such a person at all. She would probably have refused such a tempting offer if it hadn't been for one but. Patrick Gregory had promised to help with Jason's surgery, and that was a game changer. Emily was willing to do a lot to give her son back a normal, full life, including taking a job with such an unpleasant man. "But what are you silent?" hurried Patrick Gregory with a slight irritation in his voice. "What is there to think about?" "Yes," Emily said, a little confused. "I didn't doubt it," he said smugly, and hung up. From that moment on, Emily and Jason's lives changed dramatically. Soon they left their apartment and moved, not without Michael Phillips's help, into a luxurious house in the center of the city, right next to the clinic. It was within walking distance of everything they needed to live. The businessman fulfilled his second promise. Jason underwent surgery as soon as possible, and he was able to walk normally again, even to run. The boy immediately picked up a new sports section. Of course, the time when he had to actively train to become a professional was irretrievably lost. But now he went to classes solely for his own pleasure. Besides, Emily, again not without the chief's help, had managed to get Jason into a prestigious grammar school. She was very worried about how relations would work out in the new school. However, the classmates, who knew nothing about the former poor life of the new friend, accepted him as one of their own. In general, everything went better than one could imagine. Emily now had to go to work no more than 4 times a week. And she got a lot more money for it than she had before, when she worked practically no weekends. She could finally get some rest and take care of herself. For the first time in a long time, she went for a manicure, renewed her hair, and bought some nice clothes. However, something about this idyllic picture was not right. Something was bothering Emily, making her uneasy. Only she couldn't figure out what it was. She couldn't catch these elusive feelings and give them a meaningful, logical, verbal form. And this strange uneasiness only grew stronger day by day. At first, she'd thought it was the result of her prejudice against Michael Phillips, despite all he'd done for her and Jason. She really didn't like her employer. And the longer Emily talked to him, the more she became convinced that the man wasn't who he said he was. "I think you're really getting yourself worked up," Jason told his mother when she shared her suspicions with him. "Well, of course he's an unpleasant type. I agree. It's his attitude toward everyone who's even a little poorer than he is. But I don't think there's anything more behind it." "Yeah, you're probably right," Emily sighed. "But after all, you could always go back to work at your hospital," the boy pointed out. "You'd be hired there. They might even give you a bigger salary, but not that much. It wouldn't be enough to pay for your gymnasium." "Come on, I'll get over it," somehow said the son lightly. But no, Emily cut him off. "The better education you get, the easier life will be for you. If we're going to have this chance, we should take it, regardless of any silly superstitious fears." But she didn't feel the confidence in her voice at all. Something was definitely wrong, and that something had a direct and immediate connection to the new job and to this private clinic in general. Something about her was subtly wrong. Emily had often heard strange bits of conversation from the nurses and other doctors, and she herself sometimes had to perform strange surgeries using materials of unknown origin. She began to behave more carefully, listening to the conversations, paying attention to some small details, and finally she realized what was bothering her. The very materials she had been working with and more. Where did they come from in such quantity? Would so many people dying in their small town bequeath their bodies for tissue and organ transplants? It was simply impossible to believe it. There was only one explanation for what was happening: the illegal removal of organs from people who were still alive. Emily didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't find any other explanation. Her last hope, her last straw to cling to, was to talk directly to Michael Phillips. Perhaps he would have a more reasonable and legitimate explanation for what was happening. Emily didn't even bother to challenge the charges. They were taking organs and tissue from the homeless and transplanting them into well-to-do people. Would anyone pay that kind of money for routine surgeries? It's illegal. Emily was outraged. "Yeah, just some people," Michael Phillip asked with a sneer. "Think about it for yourself, Emily. It's good for everyone. The homeless, if anything, go at it voluntarily. We're not forcing anyone to do anything. They're getting a free checkup at the highest level, mind you. And we overpay generously. And our clients get life-saving operations, which, if we had acted according to the law, they might not have waited for. So everybody wins. But these people you're taking organs from won't be able to live a full life. They'll probably have a short and painful existence," Emily objected. Michael Phillips shrugged. "It's their choice. They sign a paper that states all the possible consequences. But is it our problem if they don't read it? Apparently money is more important to them. I can't do that. I'm quitting. You want to do such inhumane things, do it without me." "Michael Phillip, this is unacceptable," Emily said firmly. "How am I going to let you go if you know everything now? Plus, with such a negative attitude towards my clinic," Michael Phillip said softly. "So what? You're going to kill me? Transplant my organs to some rich guy?" Emily asked wryly. "Why be so rude? I made it clear we're not killing anyone. Think about your son Jason. He goes to a good school, goes to a prestigious section, lives in an inexpensive neighborhood. What would happen to him if he lost all that? Or worse, if everyone finds out about his past, that he's out of their league? That would be a lot easier to arrange than murder, and the effect would be more devastating." Emily had no choice but to work at the clinic. She cursed her cowardice, but she couldn't let Jason lose everything again and become an object of ridicule. It would be cruel to her son. However, Emily couldn't accept what was happening at the clinic. She decided to collect evidence of illegal activities, first of all to hide hidden cameras. After all, a direct recording of the management's orders about the crimes is the best proof. Emily also educated the poor people who came to sell organs for a pittance, explaining the risks and consequences. Some listened, but most didn't seem to care. "You know, if I go for it now, I might have the consequences you're talking about. But if I don't, I'll starve to death right now," one of them told her bluntly. This aspect of her work was nearly fruitless, and it wasn't going well with evidence collection either. The nurses who had been chattering in front of her earlier had abruptly stopped talking. Apparently someone had warned them not to talk in front of Emily. In addition, she was never alone in the clinic. There was always someone from the staff or Michael Phillip himself. She was not trusted and was being watched. Acting in such an environment was not easy. Emily had already purchased a camera, which she was going to install in the reception area on River Street, and brought it to work with her every shift. But there was never a chance to put the device anywhere. She was once again trying to figure out how to get away from the constant surveillance and finally make it happen when another escort approached her. It was a young surgeon, Jason, whom Emily knew only superficially. She knew he was an excellent specialist, or he wouldn't be in this clinic. But that was all. Not once during their work together had they exchanged a single word. And now she was surprised to see this young talent, who, standing in front of him, was thrashing around, and as if she did not dare to speak. "Have you any question for me?" she politely inquired. "Emily, I admire you," he suddenly blurted out. "I heard you talking to your superiors. You know what it was about. And then, when you persuaded those homeless people not to go to the transfer. That's very brave. I, on the other hand, Never made up my mind. So you know what's going on here, too, she asked. Yeah, it's hard not to, he retorted. But I can assure you I don't approve of all this. There was a chance, of course, that this was some kind of trap or test. A man had been sent to her to pretend to be in league with her, to ferret out some of her schemes. And why not? But something in Jason's demeanor, in his intonation, told her he was being completely sincere. You may have noticed, she began cautiously, that since that unfortunate conversation, I've been guarded by guards watching my every move. That's for sure, he nodded. There have been such orders from your superiors, but I take it no one suspects you of anything. He shook his head silently. Then I have one small favor to ask of you. Nothing dangerous, I assure you. I just want to set up a camera in the residence room to record everything that happens here. Understood, Jason nodded. I'm in. With a light heart, Emily handed him the device. Somehow she was sure the young surgeon wouldn't let her down, and together they could put an end to the criminal activities of the clinic and its owner. With that thought in mind, she headed home. The workday was just coming to an end, and her mood was elevated for the first time in many days. Emily walked out of the hospital building and down the path that led to the wicket. The evening was cool, but quiet and windless. No trees rustled, no birds sang. In short, there was absolute, even a little frightening silence. That must have been the reason she heard the sound. It was very, very quiet, like a wheeze or something. And if there had been any sound on the grounds of the clinic that evening, there was no way in hell she would have been able to pick it up. But there was nothing else. Emily heard it and froze for a second, paralyzed with terror. She knew that only a living thing could make such a sound, and only in the moment before its own demise. Recovering from the shock, she rushed in the direction from which that strange and frightening half-whispered half-monk was coming. Soon she saw a man. He was not old, and he was wearing some kind of tattered jacket and the same sad-looking jeans. He was sitting with his back against the hospital wall. His eyes were closed, but a thin trickle of vapor escaped from his mouth, indicating that he was still alive. Emily rushed to him, touched him, he was hot, examined him, and realized with horror what she might have guessed before. This poor man was clearly one of those who decided to sell their own health, and maybe even their life, to the clinic. The wound on his lower back had been so carelessly stitched that the stitches had come apart almost immediately, blood oozing out of them and pouring all over the place. Emily didn't have time to think. She was glad she almost always carried a first aid kit with her. It had excellent supplies and alcohol for disinfecting. The only thing missing was an anesthetic strong enough to keep the patient from feeling the surgery. We had to proceed without anesthesia. However, the doctor suspected that the poor man didn't care. It could hardly get any worse than it is now. Be patient, she said, wielding a surgical needle. We have to stop the bleeding. You'll feel better soon. Emily herself didn't know why she was having this conversation. The man was clearly in no condition to hear or understand her. But maybe something was getting through to his fading mind, and he was getting calmer. Emily didn't realize that there was a third man in that unfortunate alleyway besides the two of them. He watched in horror as the scene unfolded before his eyes. His mother was in the middle of the street, in front of the clinic where she worked, performing surgery on an obviously homeless man. It didn't make any sense to Jason. The fact that Emily was helping a stranger didn't surprise him. But why hadn't she taken him to the clinic? Why hadn't she done all the necessary procedures in the warm, sterile conditions of the operating room instead of out on the cold street, using improvised instruments? It's like she was doing something forbidden, shameful, or illegal. And he just wanted to meet his mother from work and even brought her a bouquet of flowers, bought with his pocket money, which was now lying at his feet. He wanted to please her. And now this. What had she gotten herself into? Jason knew he had to get to the bottom of this. He turned around and headed home. When his mom came home from work, he didn't ask her anything. It wasn't because he suspected her. It was just that he realized how upset she would be if she knew her son had witnessed her strange behavior. First, we have to figure things out, and then we can talk about them. For days, right after school, Jason had been heading toward the clinic and watching carefully. He saw vagrants like the one his mother had operated on walk-in. He saw them leaving the building hours later, struggling to stay on their feet. They always entered from the back door, and expensive cars drove up to the front door. People in expensive suits would get out of them, and they'd leave the clinic with a different, confident, healthy stride. And they spent a lot more time there. I guess Jason decided to himself they're giving free help to the homeless. Only not everyone does it well. That's what Mom had to do to undo the damage, but there was something about this version of the story that made him uneasy. Michael Phillip did not look like a man who does charity, albeit careless. Nor did this version explain why Mom had to work outside in the dark, as if hiding from someone. In the end, Jason decided to follow one of the vagrants who had left the clinic. He went straight to the store and bought a whole bunch of groceries, including delicacies. Jason noticed that he had a loaf of sausage sticking out of the bag. It was the kind of sausage he and his mom could only afford on holidays. It seemed very strange to him. He moved on, trying to remain unnoticed, but nothing interesting happened. Like a common bum, the man Jason had been following came to a shack in the vacant lot. There were quite a few of those around here. A whole town. People must have lived here as a community, helping each other with the hard street life. I wonder what all this means, Jason muttered, amazed. He decided that there was only one way to uncover the truth: to talk to one of these strange people. Something told him it was better not to go in there in an expensive suit with the badge of an elite private school. Better to pretend to be his own. Then the dialogue would go smoothly. The next day he dug out an old t-shirt and jeans. God knows why his mom kept them. But Jason was glad the clothes weren't going to the dumpster. A little mud on the way out, and he looked like a townie. This time he went up there in the afternoon. Life was in full swing. Some were socializing, some were washing clothes in a basin of river water, some were eating, and some were just basking in the sun from their huts. Cautiously sideways, Jason squeezed past the motley company, going unnoticed. Finally, a rough male voice called out to him. "Where are you from?" "I know everyone here. I haven't seen you." "Don't be angry," Uncle Jason said sadly. "I ran away from the orphanage a few days ago. It's impossible to live there. I was looking for something to eat, and I came across your town. Orphanages aren't easy, of course." The stranger softened. "I escaped from there myself. Come, don't be afraid, we won't hurt you. We'll find something." Jason stayed at the hut, which apparently belonged to the stern man. He had gone somewhere else, walking around the town, explaining things to the people. Everyone gave him crumbs, some a piece of bread, some a sausage, some a dryer, some a candy. Finally, the hobo returned with his riches. Jason felt ashamed that he was cheating people who already had nothing, but the part must be played to the end. He gnawed greedily at the sandwich, as if he hadn't eaten in days. "Uncle, how do you get such good sausage?" As if by accident, he asked. "I ate such sausage only when I lived with my parents on holidays. It is expensive." The man looked at him suspiciously, waved his hand, and sat down next to him. He hesitated for a moment, considering whether to speak. "It's not cheap sausage, but it was hard work," he finally decided. "I don't know if it's worth it. But you're a smart guy, you're not a little boy. There's a clinic here, doing surgeries for the rich. Organ transplants, they promise to do it fast. Much faster than anywhere else. And more expensive, too." Jason listened with bated breath. He thought he knew where the story was going, but he desperately didn't want to believe it. "Where do you get these organs?" The man continued. Right, to ask those who value sausage more than their own kidney or, say, a piece of liver. That's why their agitators have been coming to us. The money they're offering is unbelievable. Well, the vagrants only think so. It's really not that much. I know what I'm talking about. I wouldn't have dreamed it before. People do this willingly? Jason couldn't believe it. They do, he nodded. Even though I've tried to explain that it's an abyss, they won't listen. They say they're going to die anyway, and here at least they've had a decent life for the last time. And to whom? It's a sin to be honest, they're thirsty. They don't take such people, though. Their bodies aren't in the right condition. He shook his head. It's a nightmare. That's right, the man nodded. And I say even a kid like you understands. But these guys don't get it. Although it would seem that they have recently seen with their own eyes what happens when you agree to such things. How did you see that? Jason wondered. Like this. One of our poor bastards, you see, was stitched up badly and thrown out on the street. Why keep him in their clean clinic? Come out of anesthesia, get paid, and walk away. So he started bleeding right outside the hospital. Probably would have died there. If he hadn't been the first one to go out and never come back. Jason was practically out of breath. How did you find out about him? Someone found him. Not one of ours. Doctor was coming out of work, saw him and felt sorry, I guess. Decided to do the right thing and brought him here. But where do we put him? The clinic doesn't allow it. She explained how to care for it. I was very happy when I told you that the doctor also tried to explain to everyone that it was a bad idea, even though she works among these scum. Of course she's a good one. Jason wanted to scream, but held back. Everything made sense to him now, and it was time to go home. He was thinking about sneaking out when he realized that no one was looking at him. The former doctor had left on business, and no one was interested in the boy. So he made it home safe and sound. Emily, as usual, came home late at night tired and sad. Jason didn't want to alarm his mom, but realized he couldn't keep quiet anymore after what he had learned. Mom, I found out something about the clinic where you work. Something unpleasant. Jesus. But how did you get into all this? I saw you operating on a vagrant on the street a couple weeks ago. It struck me as odd, so I decided to find out what it was all about. Came across a shack and a house. Talked to the locals. You're quite the detective, despite the dangerous situations. Emily was proud of her son for a second. Yes, I've been aware of our clinic's activities for some time now, but not enough evidence to go to the police yet. There are cameras, though. Hopefully they'll record everything necessary. Yes, that would be good, Jason said furiously. You can't treat people like that. And if there's anything I can do to help, what can you do to help? Emily thought. And in fact, stay out of it. But instead she said, I'll think about it. There may be something to be found, but it's best not to do anything or tell anyone for the time being. Otherwise it'll get to Michael Phillip, and exposure will be jeopardized. Okay, Jason agreed. The next day Emily went to the clinic, as usual, and right on the doorstep she was met with an unpleasant surprise, Michael Phillip himself. And the sight of him didn't bode well. The boss was breathing heavily, his nostrils flared, barely containing his anger. I'm sick of your jokes, he literally growled. I don't understand. What's wrong? Emily calmly retorted. And I don't recall us ever getting on a first-name basis. Calmness didn't come easy to her. It was hard to keep her composure, because as soon as she saw the chief, she knew it was a lost cause. He must have found out about the cameras somehow. Had Patrick Gregory told her? No, then it would all come out quicker. You don't get it, Michael Phillip continued. The camera in the residence room is your work. You hid it so no one would find it. In a flower, you see. And the cleaning lady noticed it when she was watering it. I destroyed the notes, so don't even think about it. I wasn't thinking anything like that, and I have no idea what camera you're talking about. Emily continued to guffaw. I've warned you. One more stunt like that, and you and your son will go straight to the streets with the very homeless people you've grown so fond of. With that, he walked off into the back of the clinic. Emily remained standing on the doorstep, crushed and stunned. She felt like everything was gone. He had found the camera, destroyed the evidence. Now she no longer had any evidence, and there was hardly any chance of setting up surveillance again. All day she walked around as if she'd been dunked in water. Luckily, Andrew had agreed to fill in for her on a couple of surgeries. Emily just wasn't sure she could keep her hands from shaking. And that, in turn, had the potential to be disastrous. That evening she shared her distress with her son. He responded emotionally, and at the last moment he delayed not to use a harsh expression. But that's no reason to despair. Well, there's no camera footage, but there's other evidence. But take the homeless. Not all of them are happy about what's going on, but some of them might be willing to testify. You're right. Emily nodded thoughtfully. And I'm sure the paperwork's a mess, too. Oh, she slapped her forehead. Why didn't it occur to me before? Michael Phillip didn't say those poor people signed any papers. That's the best proof that such operations were really carried out. Why would he do that? Jason frowned. To keep dirt on himself. So that if it were to come out, he could at least prove that it was all voluntary. But it's a safety net. But it's also a compromise, isn't it? Well, I'll tell you what, why don't you get those papers? I'd go out tomorrow night and talk to the homeless. Emily looked at her son doubtfully, but then waved her hand and approved his plan. He'd already gotten himself into this story anyway, and he wasn't going to back down. At least keep him away from the clinic. This time Jason didn't want to break the comedy of dressing up as a homeless boy. He didn't want to be dressed as a homeless boy this time, and he didn't want to look like one. On the way he stopped at the store and bought a variety of food to give to the hungry. The bag was so heavy that he could hardly carry it. He probably wouldn't have dragged it at all if he hadn't met that former doctor on the way. He helped with the heavy load. He appeared so unexpectedly that Jason was frightened at first. But of course he quickly calmed down and gratefully handed some of the luggage to his unexpected companion. "Thank you," he said, and hesitated. "Oh, and I don't even know your name." "Everyone calls me Willie," smiled the homeless man. "And actually it's me who should thank you. You brought us food." "I knew you weren't what you pretended to be. It's not just food," Jason began carefully. He briefly outlined the plan he and his mom had come up with. Willie frowned and at first flatly refused to deal with the police or give any statements. But Jason, after a long argument, managed to convince the man that it was necessary. Together they persuaded several other people who were also not happy about what was happening. In addition, Jason managed to find out what had happened, and another event was sad, but also hopeful. An unfortunate homeless man, who was operated on by his mom, never managed to recover already as if and began to come to his senses. But then he suddenly became bad. As a result, he passed away. On the one hand, this contributed to the fact that more and more people began to doubt whether it was worth making such sacrifices. On the other hand, they now had a body, physical evidence that was the best they could come up with. They hadn't had time to bury the poor guy yet, so it was a good time to call the police. Things were going well for Emily, too. With Andrew's help, she managed to get all the necessary documentation and more. She had gotten her hands on the protocols of the experiments. It turned out that the vagrants were not only removed organs, but also put on them horrible experiments. In the end, even without any video recordings, the three conspirators managed to gather enough evidence to close the clinic and put the owner behind bars for a long time. It would seem that this should have been the end of Emily and Jason's rich life. But they still had some savings left, and his mother hoped that it would be enough for her son to finish his studies at a prestigious grammar school. Of course, they would have to return to the cramped apartment and cut back on spending. Emily was ready to go back to work at her old hospital and live a life of self-denial as before, just to give Jason a better future. However, none of that happened. Quite unexpectedly, Emily received an inheritance from a lonely businessman who had recently died. "There must be some mistake," she said confusedly to the notary who had taken the news. "I didn't even know him." "You knew him. You knew him," he replied. "You just didn't remember. A long time ago he was in the city hospital with a heart attack. And you saved his life? As you can see, he never bothered to divorce his family during his long life, so he decided to bequeath everything to you. You'd think that was the real life." They were truly rich and no longer dependent on a man who was involved in terrible illegal affairs. But Emily did not feel the happiness that would not let her go. The thought that she had contributed, however unwittingly, to what was going on at the clinic. In an attempt to redeem herself, she bought the building where Michael Phillips Hospital was located and opened a new private clinic. There will certainly be no illegal experiments or atypical surgeries. In addition, the needy will be able to get free help, and not only medical. Emily set up a kitchen at the clinic, where any homeless person could get a warm meal in the morning, and also the collection of old things in good condition, which could then take the same vagrants. And very soon this place, which previously had a bad reputation, became a real salvation for people in a difficult situation. The first 2 doctors at the clinic were Andrew and William. The latter turned out to be a very good therapist. Many years ago, he lost his wife and started drinking. And when he was able to look at the world soberly again, he found himself in a hopeless situation. But now he had a fresh start. Emily herself continued to operate in her clinic, but she constantly felt that she was not doing enough. She was doing her best to help people, but she couldn't forgive herself for the horror she'd been unwittingly involved in. Jason supported his mom as best he could. Gradually, she began to come to her senses. One day, she and her son went to a distant store to buy groceries for the week ahead. She'd never learned to drive, and truth be told, she was afraid of it. So they took the old-fashioned bus. Already approaching the bus stop, they noticed a strange man sitting quietly on the edge of the bench. At first glance, you could decide that it was a simple homeless man, one of those unfortunate people who come to their clinic in the morning to feed. Dirty clothes, some cheap bracelet on his wrist, a sad, lost look in his eyes. Yet something in his appearance said that things were not as simple as they first appeared. "Can I help you?" Emily asked. "I don't know," he said, confused. "Don't think I'm crazy." "Yes, although I guess I am crazy. You see, I don't remember anything. Who am I and where did I come from? I woke up in some ditch. How long ago did you get in a fight? With someone or something? No, I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." For Emily, begging was a shame. On the other hand, she really wanted to eat. Somehow we got by. I didn't know how, but if you're embarrassed to ask for alms, maybe you shouldn't be embarrassed to take a job. She smiled. "I own a private clinic, and we are always in need of orderlies. Sorry, I know it's not the best job in the world, but anyone can do it." "Yes, I'd love to." The man cheered up. "Thank you." And Emily added one more thing. "We have an old apartment, small, but at least somewhere to live while in it. You can't go out on the street with these problems. That's what I'm telling you as a doctor." The stranger scattered in gratitude. That was the end of it. Emily handed him the keys, gave him some money, said he could take it as an advance on the job. She and Jason went to the store as planned. She couldn't get the strange man out of her mind. Something was wrong with him, and she was eager to find out what it was. He turned out to be a good employee, diligent, did not complain, did not truant. Although the work of an orderly is indeed very hard. He was never late or did not come to his shift at all. On the contrary, he often came on his days off, arguing that there was nothing to do at home anyway. And it wasn't his house. Emily felt compassion for her new acquaintance and even some sympathy for his efforts. He even managed to remember his name, Eugene. But no matter how hard they fought, nothing else came. She'd called a psychologist to look at him, and psychiatrists. Nothing. No one could do anything to make him remember even a fraction of his past. Why don't you take him to a fortune teller? Willie suddenly suggested it. A fortune teller? Emily was surprised. Excuse me, Yvonne Williamson, but I'm a man of higher education. And so are you. How could I? I didn't believe it either, he nodded. Only everything she predicted came true, and that I would lose my most precious possessions. And then even more. And that with my help the terrible atrocity would be stopped, and that then regain, led unhappy, but at least some normal and stable life. And also, by the way, but alas, the woman guessed, waiting. And apart from that, as you can see, she said everything right. All right, Emily sighed. Give me the contacts of your fortune teller, if it's better that way. Well, there I am, Willie smiled. Although Emily had taken Tiffany's address, the name of the fortune teller Williamson had been praising, she was hesitant to go to her. She was an educated, successful woman, after all. She just didn't believe in all that nonsense. She didn't know what she had told Williamson. He could have guessed something after so many years and upheavals, and simply taken a very vague and abstract prediction, which could apply to anyone, as something personal and applicable to him personally. On the other hand, it really doesn't get any worse from this approach. And if science was powerless, in Eugene's case, maybe something else would be able to get him thinking about the past. In the end, Emily decided to just ask him how he would feel about it. Well, a fortune teller is a fortune teller, he said. Not really interested. I don't think it will work, but it's worth a try. So they went to the address Willie had given them. No one opened the door for a long time. Then a hoarse cough and heavy shuffling footsteps came from behind it. Emily was certain that the door would be opened by a grandmother who, unlike all normal women, tried to pretend that she was much older than she really was. What was her surprise when on the threshold they saw quite a young girl. At first glance it was clear that Tiffany was gravely ill. Her eyes were sunken and almost invisible because of the huge bags under them. She herself was not even thin, but skinny, and to top it all off, she often suffered from a severe hoarse, senile cough. We were told a good fortune teller lived here, Emily muttered confusedly. She lives, agreed the girl, except that she hasn't kept an appointment in months. I've been sick, you see. She was about to say something else, but she suddenly stopped short. Her gaze was fixed on Eugene's hand, which was still wearing the bracelet, the only reminder of his past life. And from the looks of it, the thing was familiar to the fortune teller. Where did you get this? She asked rather sharply. That's the thing, Eugene said thoughtfully. I have no idea. Don't remember a thing. Woke up in some ditch, and my head was blank. And I had this bracelet clamped on my arm. Thought you might be able to help me with this. Come on in, Tiffany said. You don't be afraid. I realize I look terrible, but the doctors say it's not contagious. They followed the fortune teller into a tiny room that reminded Emily painfully of her old home, where Eugene now lived. It was obvious that the owner was trying to keep some semblance of order, but it wasn't easy. The house must have been sparkling clean at the best of times. Tiffany seated her guests on the soft, cozy sofa and poured tea for them. She sat in the chair opposite and thought deeply about something, as if she'd forgotten she was not alone in the house. Finally, coughing once more, she began her story. You will again pardon my condition. You have not come at the best of times. Sick. And even more so with the side effects of the medication. I even had to quit my job. I still have some savings. I'm living on it. I can see you're skeptical, desperate when no one could help you. Don't look at me like that. It doesn't take any magic to figure that out. I can see it in your eyes. And the truth is, I'm really quite useless right now. But my gift used to help people a lot. My grandmother taught me that. She raised my brother and me. She was strong, very magical, believe it or not. And when she died, I thought I could make a living with it, I opened a kind of salon right here in the apartment, furnished it, and, as it should be, I've cleaned everything up now. And to tell you the truth, it's not really necessary. It's more of an entourage for the clients. The real power is inside, not in all those supposedly magical orbs and other trinkets. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted. So I lost my brother Nicholas, my stepbrother, my stepfather's son. Only he and my mother were killed in a car accident. We were just little kids at the time. My grandmother raised us, but it was my grandmother, not his. Though she tried to give both of them love and care, but apparently he felt as if he was an extra, not his own blood. That's probably why he grew up resentful and unloved. We didn't get along very well. But I still tried to get in touch with him somehow. He's not a stranger. And then he disappeared, just stopped contacting me, that's all. And my gift was silent. I thought he was dead. I mourned him. But not so long ago, he showed up. Not just like that, but with money. Big money. We've never seen the likes of him before. He didn't want to tell me everything, saying it's none of your business. Don't be jealous. But I wasn't jealous. I just thought there was something wrong. What did he do? He used the money to open a fancy fortune-telling parlor. Sells all sorts of trinkets and supposedly tells fortunes. Although, of course, he doesn't have any gift. He opened a salon right across the street. And his advertising was more attractive, and predictions too. I tell people the truth, not what they want to hear. That's why people came to him. I'm almost broke. I'm out of clients. And then there's this disease. But the best part is, he's never parted with that bracelet you're wearing. His father's last gift to him. And when he came back, he wasn't wearing it. And now you have it. Perhaps you'd like to try fortune-telling. Eugene asked timidly. If I have anything to do with this story, maybe it will work. Tiffany looked at him doubtfully, but she took Eugene's palm in her ice-cold hands. She stared at the interlacing lines for a long time, but finally let go and shook her head. Nothing, she said. All illnesses are curses. But you know, there's another option. We could go to my brother's salon right now. He's right here. If you have his bracelet, it must have something to do with you, but also with what happened. That's what they did. Down the stairs and across the road. Indeed, here was the salon, a huge gleaming sign that was impossible to miss. And just as they approached, a man with a huge bag ran out of the salon. He looked at them as if guilty or frightened and quickly disappeared around the corner. Tiffany was the first to realize what that could mean, and she shrieked loudly. She rushed into the parlor. Eugene and Emily followed her. The picture before them was not a pleasant one. On the floor, unconscious, lay a man a little older than Tiffany's sister. Blood was gushing from a wound in his side. Emily pulled out her camping kit and began to stop the bleeding, reflexively, not thinking about anything else, because she was a doctor and the man in front of her was in need of help. When Tiffany regained consciousness, she pulled out her cell phone and called the police. She was promised that they would come and also send an ambulance. After doing her best, the unfortunate fortune teller sank to the floor and sobbed bitterly. Eugene stood stunned, looking at the man beside Emily. The memory came back in spurts, in flashes. He saw himself in the gutter, ripping the bracelet off Nicholas's arm, then blacking out from the impact of his fist. "Who needs you?" taunted the man. "Girls only hang on you for money. And now you don't have any money either. They're all mine. That's the reason for the fight. Eugene found out his wife was cheating on him with the driver. He wanted to talk to her, but the driver beat him to it, drove him somewhere out of town to rob her and probably kill her, but didn't follow through. Police and paramedics arrived quickly. Nicholas and Tiffany were taken away in an ambulance. Eugene was still in shock from his memories of the unpleasant details of his life. Emily had to explain herself to the police. Then she and Eugene went to his house. It was empty and dreary, as if no one had visited in months. "Where's Catherine?" murmured quietly to the landlord. "Her things are all here untouched." They lived with the ugliness. Something must have happened here. "We'll find an explanation," Emily said and took his hand firmly. The explanation did come, and quickly. Eugene, who had regained his memory, had no trouble finding out about his wife. She had died in childbirth, apparently pregnant by Nicholas. The baby survived, but no one ever showed up to pick him up from the hospital, and the baby went to an orphanage. Eugene, though he knew perfectly well that it was not his son, could not leave the poor baby alone and took him to himself. Or rather to say to them, because now with Emily and Jason they lived together. She accepted her lover's decision and promised to be the best mom she could for the baby. It took a few more weeks before Tiffany called them and invited them to come visit. The baby was left to Jason, who was old enough and responsible enough to watch his little brother for a few hours. Emily and Eugene sat down again on the cozy, soft couch and listened to the fortune teller's story again. The police reported, "Look, this is a nightmare. It turns out that my brother not only cheated people, but also sold them some crap under the guise of medicine. Some cheating customer decided to get back at him. His wife died because she'd been treated with these tricks and quarrels. She didn't want to go to the doctors. And then what was in his bag?" Emily wondered. "We thought it was a burglar. Just the very mix of quarrels. He raked up everything he could find and beat all the cans with kneelers to the nearest dumpsters. That's where the cops picked him up. They say he was in a completely inadequate state. They won't exonerate him, of course, but I don't think he's looking at anything serious. Especially since Nicholas survived. The doctors say it's thanks to you, Emily, but he's definitely going to prison." She told it all with both relief and a kind of longing in her voice. Her brother, though not her own, was such a bad man. It's not an easy thing to get over. "You look much better than you did last time," Emily tried to cheer her up. "Is it possible that the medication has begun to work?" "If only." Tiffany grinned bitterly. "It was much simpler than that. Nicholas congratulated me quietly so that I couldn't work. Once he was taken first to the hospital and then to the police, the symptoms stopped at once." Stunned by what she had heard, Emily, on a sudden impulse, stood up and hugged the unfortunate fortune teller tightly. From then on, they became good friends and constantly went to visit each other. And at the wedding, which soon played Eugene and his beloved, Tiffany was the guest of honor.